Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I thought the place looked cheap and a bit run down, but I signed the lease anyway. The building manager handed me a set of keys without explaining anything about the layout or the other residents. I walked through the lobby and saw a dim hallway with a single overhead light flickering at the far end. I didn't see a doorman or any security cameras. The elevator made a grinding noise on the way up. My unit was on the top floor at the end of a corridor that smelled like stale air and cleaning fluid. The moment I stood in front of my door, I noticed how the hallway was dead quiet. I remember thinking that the silence felt oppressive, as though it was pressing against my ears. I shrugged off the feeling and stepped inside. The apartment had old carpet, chipped paint, and a small bedroom in the back. I had a foldable bed, a desk, and a tiny closet. I was tired from work, so I tossed my suitcase on the floor, opened the window for a bit of fresh air, and then sat on the bed to rest. The first night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. My eyes snapped open because I heard something outside my door. It sounded like steps, one after the other, stopping right in front of my place. I couldn't tell if it was a single person or several people. The noise continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I got up bare feet on the cold floor, walked quietly across the living area, and moved closer to the door. My pulse was thudding in my head. I leaned toward the door and listened. Silence. I peered through the peephole. The hallway was dark, lit only by a weak bulb near the elevator, but I could see the space directly in front of my door. Nobody stood there. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. I felt my legs tense, and my breathing grew shallow. I wasn't sure what to do, so I went back to bed and tried to convince myself it was a neighbor coming home late. Maybe someone was lost or checking the room numbers. It made me uneasy, but I managed to fall asleep again after a while. The next morning I woke up early for work. I checked the hallway before leaving. Everything was normal in the daylight. The corridor looked the same as when I first arrived. A long stretch of doors, a few burnt-out lights, and a dusty exit sign. I tried to forget about the footsteps. I reminded myself that it was just my second day there, and I didn't want to start losing sleep over small things. At work, I focused on my tasks and tried to keep busy. Around lunchtime, I noticed I felt jumpy whenever I heard someone walking down the office hall. My mind drifted back to those footsteps outside my apartment door, but I forced myself to ignore it and push through the day. That night, I prepared dinner in the tiny kitchen area. I had a cheap lamp on the counter and the overhead light was flickering. There was some kind of faulty wiring in the ceiling. While I was eating, I thought I heard the pipes knocking in the walls. It was a rhythmic sound, like a distant series of taps. I put my fork down and listened, but it stopped. My phone buzzed and I realized it was a message from a coworker. That small interruption helped me relax. After dinner, I paced around, trying to make myself comfortable. The living area had a little couch, a coffee table, and an old TV that barely worked. I turned it on for background noise, but the signal kept cutting out. The place felt too silent without any static or hum. I eventually went to bed around 11. I fell asleep faster than I expected. Then, around the same time as the night before, I woke up again. The footsteps were there, right outside my door. The pattern was the same. A few steps, a pause, then a few more steps. Then they stopped. My heart pounded so hard I was sure I could hear it in my ears. I got up and went to the door with shaky legs. I hesitated before looking through the peephole. Once again, I saw nothing but the empty hallway. My mouth went dry, and my hand trembled on the doorknob. A part of me wanted to fling the door open to catch whoever it was, but fear locked me in place. Instead, I whispered, "Who's out there?" No answer, no movement. I stood there until my back started to ache, but I never heard another sound. I spent the next few days jumping at every little noise in the building. I also started to notice something odd. The floor above mine was sealed off. The elevator buttons didn't include that floor, and the stairwell door had a chain and a large lock. I saw a "Do Not Enter" sign that looked years old. When I asked the building manager about it, he gave me a quick shrug and said, "It's closed for maintenance." Then he walked off, avoiding any details. I asked a neighbor, an older guy from the end of the hall, about the upper floor. He shook his head and said, "Hasn't been open in ages. They say it's unsafe. I don't go up there." He looked nervous and didn't want to discuss it further. The footsteps at night kept happening, always around the same time, always stopping outside my door. I started keeping a flashlight next to my bed. I also started keeping my shoes near the door, just in case I decided to bolt out of the apartment in the middle of the night. The tension in my body built up to the point where my neck and shoulders felt stiff all day. My concentration at work suffered. My boss asked if I was feeling okay, and I lied, telling him I just had trouble sleeping because of the new environment. One evening, I decided to explore the building a bit more. I wanted to see if I could find a vent or a pipe that might explain the noises. I walked down the hallway, checking each door, looking for anything unusual. Most doors looked the same, except for some chipped paint or missing apartment numbers. Then I noticed a small access panel near the stairwell. It was at floor level, and it appeared to be an old maintenance hatch. I knelt down and tried to pull it open, but it was stuck. I heard a scuffling sound behind me and turned fast, but no one was there. My heart was beating like a drum. I felt sweat collecting on my forehead. I took a breath and headed back to my apartment, feeling embarrassed for scaring myself over nothing. Another night passed, and I woke up again to the same damn footsteps. I looked through the peephole and the hallway was still empty. I felt an eerie sensation, like something was watching me from just out of view. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and opened it a few inches. The corridor was nearly dark because the single light fixture flickered overhead. The air felt heavy and stale. I peered out, stepping over the threshold. Nobody was there. I walked a few feet, passing the neighboring doors. I reached the elevator and stared at the closed metal doors, half expecting them to open. They stayed shut. I turned to go back to my unit, and I thought I saw a shape at the far end of the hallway, near the emergency exit. It was just a fleeting impression. I squinted, but the flickering light made it impossible to see clearly. My scalp tingled, and I felt goosebumps on my arms. I hurried back into my apartment and locked the door. Things escalated when I tried to investigate the sealed floor. I waited until late evening when the building seemed quiet. I walked up the stairwell, past my floor, to the door that was chained shut. I examined the lock. It was old and rusted. I pulled on the chain a bit, hearing the metal scrape. Then I heard a noise from inside the locked area. It was soft, like movement on the other side of the door. I froze. My first impulse was to run back down, but I gritted my teeth and pressed my ear against the door. I could make out a faint shuffling sound. Then it stopped. My hands were shaking. I turned around and descended the stairs quickly, skipping steps. My mind was racing with possibilities. I wondered if someone was squatting up there, or if there was some hidden passage that allowed them to roam. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Over the next few days, I tried to ask some of the longer-term residents about the place. Most gave me evasive answers. One woman, who lived on the floor below mine, said people used to talk about seeing strange figures at night. She said they looked like silhouettes that hovered near the walls. When I pressed for more details, she clamped her mouth shut and walked off. My tension grew each time I walked down the hallway to my door. I started glancing behind me, checking corners, listening for odd sounds. Every time I entered my apartment, I felt a sense of dread, like I was waiting for the next round of footsteps to start. I considered moving out. I even visited a rental office in another part of town, but the agent there told me they had nothing available immediately. That's when I remembered something. The last time I had to move, it was because I heard similar noises in my previous apartment. Back then, I also assumed it was just the building. But then I moved to another place after that, and I heard the same noises again. Each time it happened late at night. Each time I felt watched. Each time there was never anyone there when I checked. I got goosebumps thinking about how all these events lined up. Maybe something had been following me. I felt my gut tighten with dread. I tried to rationalize it. I tried telling myself there was a logical explanation, but my body reacted every night the same way. My chest felt tight, my breathing got shallow, and my mouth went dry the moment I woke up to those footsteps. Around this time, I started having trouble focusing at work. My coworkers noticed I looked tired and on edge. I made excuses about deadlines and traffic. Deep down, I knew it was the night events wearing me down. My boss sent me home early one day saying I needed rest. But going back to that apartment early felt worse. I didn't want to be there alone with hours of silence ahead of me. Despite my fear, I decided I had to do something. I returned to the stairwell late at night with a flashlight. I crept past my floor and stood in front of that chained door again. The hallway was dark, and I kept the flashlight pointed at the lock. I tugged at it, hoping maybe it would break. It didn't. Then I aimed the flashlight through a gap between the door and the frame. I couldn't see much, just some debris and part of an old hallway that extended into darkness. I felt like something was staring back at me. My hair stood on end. I heard a soft shuffle again. My breathing grew labored, and I backed away. I whispered, "Hello?" It made no sense to speak. I got no reply, just that heavy silence. I hurried back to my apartment. That same night, around 2 a.m, the footsteps came again. This time they were louder. They seemed to circle right outside my door. I grabbed the flashlight and tiptoed to the door. My hand was sweaty, and I tried to steady the light. Through the peephole, I saw nothing. Then I heard a scrape against the door, like a fingernail or a key. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. I wanted to fling the door open to confront whoever it was, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I backed away from the door, holding the flashlight in front of me like a weapon. The scraping stopped. Then the footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. I stumbled to the couch and sat there trembling until morning. Over the next few days, I tried to spend as much time outside as possible. I stayed late at work, went to a diner for dinner, and only returned to the building when I was too exhausted to stay awake. I hoped that by being so tired, I'd sleep through the night. It didn't help. The footsteps still woke me up. My eyes would shoot open, and I'd be immediately drenched in sweat. It was like my body recognized that sound at a deeper level. The sense of being watched never went away. During the day, I sometimes felt that same sensation at the office or while walking on the street. I'd glance over my shoulder, but nobody was there. I started leaving notes under my door, asking whoever was out there to stop. I wrote things like, "If you need help, knock," or "Please leave me alone." Each time, the note was still under my door in the morning, untouched. One afternoon, I talked to the building manager again. I asked him if anyone else had complained about noises at night. He shrugged and said, "Sometimes people hear things. It's an old building." He avoided eye contact. I asked if I could break my lease early. He said that would cost me a penalty, and I wouldn't get my deposit back. I stood there frustrated, trying not to lose my temper. I also realized something strange. I couldn't find any cleaning staff or maintenance workers. The building manager seemed to be the only person who showed up regularly. The corridors always looked the same, dusty and poorly lit. I saw trash bags piling up in the main trash room. It felt like the whole place was neglected. The old neighbor who lived at the end of my hall sometimes stood in his doorway looking uneasy. But he didn't offer any new information. He just said, "I keep my head down. That's all I can do." That sentence made me uncomfortable. It felt like he knew more than he wanted to say. Time dragged on and my anxiety got worse. One night I put on my jacket and decided to wait for the footsteps in the hallway. I stood near the elevator with the flashlight off. I wanted to see who or what was walking around. I waited until around 2 a.m. I heard the first creaks of the floorboards. Then I heard the steps approach my door. They stopped. I held my breath, straining to see any shape. There was nothing visible in the dim light, yet the sound of steps was clear. I could even hear what sounded like breathing, low and steady. My pulse pounded, and my throat felt tight. I stood still, trying not to make any noise. After a moment, the steps moved away. They passed right by me, but I didn't see anyone. I felt a chill spread through my whole body. I could sense a presence, like something moving through the hall. I turned the flashlight on, shining it around. There was no one. The corridor was empty. The steps faded, and I was left standing there, heart racing with no answers. I went back into my apartment and slammed the door. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I contacted a few more rental agencies. Every place that might have had a vacancy told me there was nothing available for immediate move-in. I considered staying in a motel, but that triggered a memory of how, during a previous job assignment, I stayed in a motel and still experienced weird noises at night. I realized that wherever I went, these occurrences followed. That thought made my stomach twist. I felt trapped. It's been several weeks now. The noises haven't stopped. Each night those footsteps come, and each night I check the hallway to find it empty. I've stopped trying to find logical explanations. I accept that something is attached to me. I don't know why or how, and I don't know what it wants. All I know is that I hear it and feel it, and it refuses to go away. The sealed floor above me stays locked. I still hear occasional shuffling from behind that chained door, but I've given up on investigating it. I don't have the courage to break in. The building manager offers no help, and the few neighbors who live here want to stay out of it. I sometimes pace around the apartment, checking the windows, making sure they're locked. I've started locking the bathroom door and the closet door before I go to bed, even though it makes no sense. I just feel safer knowing every possible entrance is secured, even if it's only in my imagination. My body feels constantly tense. My shoulders ache and my jaw is sore from clenching my teeth. I wish I could run away, but I have nowhere to go. Even if I did, I'm scared this thing would follow me again. Right now I'm sitting at my desk, typing this out on my laptop. The building is quiet except for the low hum of my fridge. The clock shows it's almost midnight. I have a flashlight and a phone beside me. I'm not sure if anything can help when the footsteps start, but I keep them nearby because it gives me a tiny sense of comfort. I plan to push through my work assignment here until I save enough money to break the lease and leave. But deep down, I suspect it won't matter where I go next. Something is with me, and it won't let go. I feel a vibration in the floorboards. I pause and hold my breath. Is that the elevator moving? Or is it someone pacing in the corridor? My heart rate jumps. My palms sweat. I'm too nervous to open the door and look. This is my life now, a series of tense nights, waiting to hear those steps. I don't know when this will end. I don't know if it can end. I just know that every time I've tried to escape before, it always finds me. And I'm convinced it's going to keep finding me, no matter where I go. I never expected to find anything interesting in my attic. I thought I'd see a few boxes of old clothes, some chipped porcelain figures, and maybe some forgotten photo albums. Instead, I found a faded wooden crate with thick rope handles, pushed into a dark corner behind broken furniture. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The nails on the lid were loose, so I pulled them out with my hands. Inside, I discovered a stack of yellowed papers, each covered with cramped handwriting. One sentence on the top page grabbed my attention right away. It steals identities by touching shadows. I felt a chill on my arms. I was standing in a dusty attic with only a single overhead bulb. The floorboards creaked under my feet. I glanced around to make sure I was alone. My breath tasted stale, and I noticed a dry feeling in my mouth. I flipped through the pages and saw drawings of a dark figure hiding in corners. Some paragraphs described how it preferred heights and tight spaces. Others talked about capturing it, though it was never actually caught. I remember swallowing hard and wiping a film of sweat off my forehead as I tried to process what I was reading. I decided to read everything in order, so I sat on an old chest and held the stack of papers under the light. The notes belonged to someone who used to live in the house a long time ago. They never mentioned a name, but they wrote about a creature that could look like any person as long as it had touched that person's shadow. There were instructions on how to track it, tips about where it might hide, and a few warnings about never standing in direct light near certain corners. I rubbed my temples. It sounded ridiculous, but the tone in those notes felt urgent and desperate, and something in me wouldn't let it go. I was up there for an hour or so, reading one page after another. My back started hurting and my legs cramped from sitting on that hard chest. I got up and paced around a few times. I heard the floor squeaking under me. I kept thinking about the phrase, "It steals identities by touching shadows." The rest of the text described sightings, near misses, and strange reflections caught in mirrors. The person who wrote it believed the creature would sometimes appear as a neighbor or a friend, but only for a short period. Then it would vanish and leave no trace. There was a line that said, "It prefers to hide in high places and tight spaces." I lifted my eyes to the rafters. My attic had old beams near the ceiling. The space between them was cramped and dark. I caught myself breathing faster, so I walked over to the small window to get some air. The next day I came home from work late. I was exhausted and I didn't want to think about that weird story. I went straight to the living room and dropped onto my couch. Before turning on the TV, I noticed something on the wall across from me. My shadow from the hallway light flickered for a second. It looked like my arm moved, but I hadn't moved my arm. I sat up, staring at the wall. I thought maybe I was just tired. My chest felt heavy, and I tried to slow my breathing. I waited a few minutes. Nothing else seemed off, so I switched on the television and tried to relax. My mind kept drifting to those notes, but I forced myself to focus on a random show until I got too drowsy to stay awake. The next morning, I woke up on the couch with a stiff neck. I got up and walked to the bathroom. I looked in the mirror and noticed dark circles under my eyes. My reflection was normal, though. I brushed my teeth and dressed for work. I tried to ignore a feeling of unease. In the kitchen, I made coffee and glanced at the windows. The sun was bright, and the shadows in the room were crisp. I remember noticing how my shadow on the floor seemed to pause or delay, but it was so subtle that I wasn't sure if I imagined it. My shoulders tensed and my arms felt cold. I backed up until my body was against the counter. Then I stepped away from the light, grabbed my coffee and left for work, feeling on edge. At the office, I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the floor whenever a coworker stood near me. I was checking if my shadow looked normal or if it moved out of sync. My boss asked me questions about a project, and I mumbled some short answers. I felt shaky. My hands felt sweaty, and I kept wiping them on my pants. I went to the restroom to clear my head. The mirror in there was large and bright. I could see my reflection perfectly. It looked like me, but I stared at it for a full minute. I noticed my breathing was shallow. Finally, I splashed water on my face and went back to my desk, deciding that I was probably scaring myself for no reason. When I got home that evening, I went to the attic again. I brought a flashlight and a backpack with water and a notepad of my own. I wanted to see if there was anything else in that crate. The floor groaned under me, and I kicked up a layer of dust walking around. I dragged out the crate and dug through it. There were more papers under an old blanket. I read a few lines. It avoids direct confrontation. It waits for the right moment. It can move along walls or disappear into corners. I felt a knot in my stomach when I saw that line. I shined my flashlight around the attic. The beam caught spiderwebs and piles of junk. I heard a faint scrape above me, but it might have been a bird on the roof. My heart rate sped up and I tried to breathe evenly. I decided to set up a small trap. I placed a few mirrors around the attic, angled so I could see the corners from different angles. I didn't expect much, but I wanted to do something. I left the mirrors there and went back downstairs. Over the next few days, I noticed more odd movements in my shadow. Sometimes I'd raise my right hand, and the shadow seemed to raise the left. Other times, I'd be sure I saw it shift, then snap into place. Whenever I tried to show someone else, it looked normal. I stopped inviting people over because I felt embarrassed and paranoid. My appetite dropped, and I found myself skipping meals. I just sat in the living room staring at walls and floors, waiting for my shadow to do something strange. My chest felt tight most of the time, and my legs sometimes trembled when I stood still. One evening, I decided I had to confirm if this thing was really in my house. I remembered a part of the notes about shining a strong light from behind to see if the shadow reacted differently. So I got a bright lamp and placed it at one end of the hallway. Then I stood facing the wall, watching my outline stretch out. It looked like me. I lifted my arm. The shadow lifted its arm. It was in sync. I felt my jaw clench with tension. I was about to lower my arm when I saw a slight hesitation in the outline around my head. It shifted, then snapped back. A jolt of fear shot through me. I stumbled backward, and my heart pounded so hard that I felt my pulse in my neck. I shut off the lamp and rushed to my bedroom where I locked the door. My forehead was damp and my fingers shook. I dropped onto my bed, staring at the door until I eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. That night, I dreamed about the attic. I saw the creature perched in the rafters, and it looked like a silhouette of me. I woke up covered in sweat. My chest felt tight, and I had trouble catching my breath. I looked around my bedroom. Nothing seemed off, but I felt like something was watching me. I sat on the edge of my bed until sunrise. Then I went to the attic and collected the mirrors. I wanted to check if they captured anything. I saw nothing unusual in them, just reflections of dusty boxes. I felt frustrated and on edge. I was sure that something was wrong, but I had no proof. I decided to focus on the house's history. The papers mentioned older events, so I searched online for any records about this property. I found some old news articles about strange sightings in this neighborhood. I also found a few references in local forums about an unknown figure seen climbing onto rooftops at night. None of it was definitive, but it matched the idea that something was lurking in high places. I read about a neighbor who heard scratching noises in his attic a long time ago, but he never found the source. My thoughts kept returning to the notes. It prefers high places and tight spaces. I went into every crawl space I could reach, shining a flashlight into them. The smell of old insulation and wood made me cough. A few times I thought I saw movement, but it might have been dust or insects. I kept going until I was sweating through my shirt. My head felt light from crouching and crawling. My knees hurt, and my arms were covered in dust and dirt. I didn't see anything that proved the creature was there, but I didn't feel safe either. The next day I took time off work. I stayed home to set up cameras. I borrowed a few from a friend, telling him I wanted to catch raccoons in my attic. I positioned them around my house, aiming at the attic door, the hallway, and a few corners that seemed suspicious. I felt more secure with the cameras on, but I also felt tense, wondering if I'd see something that would confirm my worst fears. Whenever I walked past a mirror, I tried not to look at my reflection. That evening, around 9, I was in the living room checking the camera feeds. The attic feed was dark. I saw a faint shape near the rafters. I leaned closer to the screen. It looked like a black form clinging to the beam. Then it shifted and disappeared. My heart thumped in my chest. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to come back, but it didn't. I felt adrenaline surging. My arms and legs tingled. I went to the hallway and flipped the switch to the attic light. My hands trembled on the ladder as I climbed up. I pushed open the attic door and held my flashlight tight. The attic was empty at first glance. The boxes looked the same. I swept the flashlight around. Nothing moved. I heard a rustling sound in the corner, so I aimed the beam there. I saw some torn insulation on the floor, but no creature. The air felt stuffy. My shirt was sticking to my back. I stood on the old boards, listening carefully. I heard a soft scraping noise behind me. I spun around and aimed the flashlight, but I only saw dust floating in the air. I climbed down and closed the attic door, feeling my heart slam against my ribs. I checked the camera feed again. The shape was gone. I paced around the living room for a while, breathing unevenly. My scalp felt prickly, and I kept rubbing my arms, trying to calm down. I recalled the notes about how it could appear as any person. I worried it was going to show up as me. I looked at my reflection in a window. I felt sweat on my forehead. I backed away from the window. Over the next few days, every small noise made me jump. I worked from home to keep an eye on the cameras. I hardly slept. I ate junk food and drank too much coffee. Each time I passed a mirror or window, I checked my reflection. Sometimes it looked like it hesitated or blinked after I blinked. My arms would tense, and my breath would catch in my throat. I'd step away, trying not to panic. My mind felt raw and scrambled. My chest felt tight all the time. I decided I needed a direct plan. The notes mentioned that the creature had never been captured, but there were attempts to corner it. The writer used bright lights and tried to corner the creature in a small space. I gathered lamps, flashlights, and spare bulbs. I spent a full afternoon setting them up around the attic access. I made sure every corner would be illuminated if I flicked the right switches. Then I waited until late at night when everything was quiet. I switched on the lights and climbed up into the attic. The space looked bright and harsh. Shadows were limited, but I still saw faint outlines in the corners. I checked the rafters. Nothing. I stepped carefully on the boards, sweeping my flashlight. My mouth felt dry. My heart was racing. I tried to lure it out by making noise, knocking on the wood and calling out. I said, "I know you're here. I just want to see you." My voice shook. I waited, holding my breath, but I got no response. After about an hour, I climbed down and shut everything off. The next day, I went through the camera footage. I found a few frames that showed something leaning over a beam, watching me. It had a head that resembled mine, but its proportions looked off. My stomach churned. I saw it inch backward out of view before I could spot it in real life. It made me realize that this thing was fast and aware of what I was doing. Now I stay alert every second. I close curtains so my shadow doesn't show on the street. I avoid strong lights. I watch how my shadow moves on the walls. Sometimes I see it lag or shift in the wrong direction. My heart hammers, and I freeze until it goes back to normal. I'm trying to find a method to expose it in front of someone else so people will believe me. I found more references in the crate that mention shining a black light on it, but I haven't tried that yet. I'm worried the creature will sense my plan and vanish. I believe it wants to replace me. I'm alone in this house and it knows I don't have many visitors. If it takes my shape and steps outside, nobody will question it. I feel like my time is running short. I barely sleep now. I sit in my living room surrounded by lamps with a flashlight in my hand. I watch my shadow while writing down every suspicious movement. My legs ache from sitting too long and my neck is stiff from turning my head to every corner. I no longer think the old notes were ramblings. I trust them completely. I'm certain this creature exists. It's in my attic, in my walls, hiding in the corners. It's waiting for the right moment to touch my shadow fully. If that happens, it can become me. I don't know how to fight it, but I'm not giving up. I won't let it take my identity. I'll search until I find a way to expose it and drive it out. I'm checking my reflection in every mirror, every window, every shiny surface. Each time I see a delay or a twitch, I feel my heart jump. But I keep looking, because I have to be ready. I won't let it steal my face or my life. I'm going to catch it before it catches me. I got a letter from a lawyer who said I inherited a mansion from an uncle I never knew. I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was some scam or a mistake. But then I saw the official stamp and the thick paper with my name spelled out, and I realized it was real. I felt a knot in my stomach. The idea of owning a giant abandoned house made me uneasy. I didn't want to drop everything to check it out, but I felt an urge to see what was going on. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe I hoped to find something valuable. I took a few days off work and drove there by myself. I arrived on a cloudy afternoon. The driveway was cracked, and the yard was overgrown with tall grass and weeds. I parked near what used to be a garden fountain. There was no water in it, just dead leaves and some broken rocks. The front door was heavy, made of dark wood with iron details. It creaked when I turned the key. The house smelled like dust and old paper. I glanced up and saw a chandelier that probably hadn't worked in decades. The hallway had thick walls and the wood paneling was chipped in some areas. I felt a slight chill even though it was summer outside. I took a moment to look around. The foyer led to a large living room on the right and a staircase on the left that went up to the second floor. In front of me there was a corridor that stretched back into the house. The air felt stale, and I heard my footsteps echo on the worn wooden floor. I decided to explore a bit. I walked through the living room first. It had old furniture, a fireplace full of ashes, and shelves with strange books. Some had symbols on the covers I didn't recognize. One looked like a journal in a language I couldn't read. I tried to open it, but the pages were stuck together. I set it back on the shelf. Next, I went into what appeared to be a small study. The desk had yellowed papers, a dried inkwell, and more books. The old leather chair squeaked when I touched it. I noticed a faint odor of something like mold or rotten wood. I stepped back into the main hallway and moved toward the stairs. Every step creaked under my weight. On the second floor, I found several bedrooms. Most were empty, except for a bed frame or a broken dresser. The windows were cloudy with dust, and I could see cobwebs in the corners. The entire place felt like it had been abandoned for years. While looking at one of the bedrooms, I noticed odd symbols along the baseboards near the floor. They looked like twisted lines, circles, and shapes that reminded me of eyes, but not exactly. They were painted in a dark red color. I felt uneasy, like I wasn't supposed to be there. My hands felt cold, and my neck tingled. I moved on, but I kept seeing more of those markings around the corners. They were subtle, but once I saw one set, I noticed others in several rooms. I spent the next few hours checking each room. I found a bathroom with a rusted tub and a sink that dripped a slow trickle of brownish water. I turned the faucet off, but it kept making a soft gurgling sound. I felt a strong urge to leave the room. The air felt heavy, and I had goosebumps. After finishing my walkthrough on the second floor, I went up to the attic. The door to the attic was a small hatch in the ceiling of the hallway. I had to pull a chain to bring down the folding stairs. It was dark up there, so I used my phone's flashlight. The space was dusty. There were boxes stacked against the walls, and I saw more strange symbols on the beams. The center of the floor had a small circular area where the dust seemed disturbed, like someone had been there more recently than the rest of the house. I moved the light around and spotted more books. These books looked older than the ones downstairs. One had a cover made of rough material that felt brittle to the touch. I felt a rush of anxiety, so I backed away and returned to the second floor. By then, it was getting late. I went back down to the main floor and found the kitchen. The fridge was off, and there was nothing but a stale smell inside it. I ate a protein bar I had in my backpack and drank some water. I considered driving back to a hotel for the night, but I wanted to stay and see if the house would give me more clues about my uncle's life. I found a dusty couch in a side room that didn't look too terrible. I unrolled a small sleeping bag on it and tried to get comfortable. The silence of the place felt overwhelming. I could hear my own breathing. There was no hum of electricity, no traffic noise, nothing but occasional creaks from the old walls. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. My throat felt dry and my heart pounded. I didn't know what had jolted me awake. Then I heard a soft whisper. It wasn't close, but it echoed through the vents. It sounded like my name, spoken slowly. My eyes were wide and I froze. I listened carefully, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The sound moved, almost like it was traveling through the ducts. I jumped up and grabbed my flashlight. I felt sweat on my forehead and my pulse throbbed in my ears. The whisper kept repeating words in a low tone. I heard something about my old car that broke down last year. The voice described details about that day. I felt a wave of confusion and fear. Nobody knew those details except me. I tried to calm down, but my hands shook. I started walking around the house, following the sound. I shined my flashlight up at the vents near the ceiling. I could hear the whisper shifting from one vent to another like it was scuttling through the air ducts. My skin crawled, and I had the urge to run out, but I wanted to see if there was something physically there. I found a ladder in a small closet. I set it up in the hallway and climbed to open the vent cover. The moment I touched the metal grate, the whisper stopped. My ears rang in the silence. I pointed my flashlight inside the duct. It was dusty, and I couldn't see any sign of a person or an animal. I climbed down, put the ladder away, and leaned against the wall, breathing hard. My chest felt tight. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't relax. I sat on the couch, shining my flashlight into the darkness. It was around 4 in the morning when the whispers started again. This time, They spoke about something else I had never told anyone. I heard words describing the first job I lost when I was 20. They got every detail right. How I had an argument with my boss, how I felt ashamed afterward. I jumped to my feet and shouted at the walls, asking who was there. My voice echoed through the empty rooms. The whispers paused for a few seconds, then continued in a slow, mocking tone. I felt my stomach clench and I hurried upstairs to escape the sound. But it followed, trailing me through the vents. When morning finally came, the whispering stopped. I was exhausted. My throat hurt from breathing the stale air and my muscles felt stiff. I decided to check out the backyard. Maybe getting outside would clear my head. I walked out through a back door that led to a large, neglected yard. There was a broken fence near the far corner, and near it I saw a glass structure. At first I thought it was a greenhouse, but when I got closer, I noticed it was an old estufa, covered in vines and strange plants. The glass panes were dirty. The door was rusted shut. I pulled on it a few times until it creaked open. Inside, the air was damp. Thick, twisted vines snaked along the frame. Some had sharp thorns that looked like little hooks. The floor was covered in cracked tiles and scattered pots. I could see wilted stems and shriveled leaves on the ground. But a few plants were still alive, stretching their tangled branches toward the light. They had dark leaves that looked almost leathery. The place gave me a bad feeling, like it was waiting for something. I heard a dripping sound from a rusted pipe. I stepped further in, being careful not to scratch myself on the thorns. I found a wooden table with a few old gardening tools. Next to them, I saw a small box. I opened it and found some notes about rituals. The handwriting mentioned forests, spirits, and spells to contact them. There were diagrams with instructions about forming a circle of certain plants. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. It was like my uncle or someone else had tried to communicate with supernatural forces right here in this greenhouse. I flipped through the notes. They described nighttime ceremonies, the need for secrecy, and references to offerings made to old spirits in the woods. There was a line about how the plants in the greenhouse could serve as conduits. I didn't understand how any of it worked, but I felt an urge to get away. The entire place smelled like wet earth and something sour, like rotting vegetation. I decided to leave the estufa before I got cut by those spiny plants. Back inside the house, I opened more drawers in the study. I found letters from decades ago addressed to different family members. Some referred to arguments over money, but others mentioned rumors of dark practices. One letter hinted that a relative had lost his mind after spending too many nights in the greenhouse. I kept reading until my eyes burned from the dust. By midday, I felt lightheaded, so I stepped outside again and drank some water. As I stood on the porch, I noticed the quiet around me. No neighbors, no cars passing by, just a rustle of wind through the overgrown yard. That evening, I set up a small battery-operated lantern in the living room. I wasn't going to spend another night alone in the dark. I sat on the couch with my flashlight near me. Around midnight, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder. My skin prickled, and I stood up. The voice said my name again, and it spoke about the house. It said it wanted me to stay. I felt my hands shaking. I shouted at it to stop, but it kept going. The words seemed to come from all sides, echoing in the vents, bouncing off the walls. Then it mentioned the greenhouse. It said the plants were hungry for attention, that they thrived on fear. I clenched my fists, trying to hold back panic. I decided to go outside to see if the whispers were in the yard too. As soon as I stepped out, the night air felt cold. I looked up at the windows of the mansion. They stared back at me, dark and empty. I heard a faint whisper from above. It called me by a childhood nickname. My stomach flipped and I felt sweat on my temples. I paced around, looking at the tall grass, the outline of the greenhouse in the distance. I didn't see anyone. The hush of the night felt heavy on my shoulders. After a few minutes, I went back in. I grabbed one of the thick books from the shelves. I flipped through the pages until I found chapters about warding off dark entities and purifying spaces. There were instructions about burning certain herbs, drawing protective symbols, and reciting incantations. I couldn't understand all the details, but I thought maybe I could try something. I searched the kitchen for any herbs, but all I found were old containers that were empty or full of mold. Then I remembered seeing some dried plants in the greenhouse. I shuddered at the thought of going back there at night, but I felt desperate. I went outside with my lantern. The greenhouse loomed, the glass panels reflecting the moonlight in a dull way. I crept inside. I looked around and saw a bundle of dried leaves on a shelf. They were tied with twine, and they smelled pungent. I grabbed them, trying not to make noise, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. I also found some chalk in a drawer under the wooden table. Then I hurried back to the main house. I lit a candle I brought with me, then I tried to follow some steps from the book. I sketched a circle on the floor with the chalk. I placed the dried leaves in the center. I read out loud the words as best I could. My heart pounded. My voice sounded shaky. I didn't know if I was doing it right. At first, nothing happened. The house stayed silent. Then a loud creak came from the hallway. I gasped and dropped the chalk. I heard a sharp whisper from the vent. It sounded angry. I saw the candle flame flicker, and a sudden gust of air swept through the corridor. The dried leaves scattered, and the circle of chalk smudged. My mouth felt dry. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with overlapping voices. They criticized me for interfering. They said the house belonged to them. They said my ancestor gave it to them long ago, that I had no right to take it away. I felt my knees shake and I stumbled back against a shelf, knocking off a few books. My thoughts raced and my skin felt clammy. I realized I had two choices: leave the mansion and never come back, or keep trying to purge whatever was inside. I picked up the book from the floor. The pages were scattered, and I tried to find the incantation again, but the text was torn. I grabbed another book, but I couldn't find the same passage. The voices grew louder, and I felt dizziness creeping in. I forced myself to breathe in and out, steadying my nerves. I took one of the bigger books and shoved it in my backpack. Then I stuffed the dried leaves inside too. I decided to step outside for fresh air. As I walked toward the front door, the walls vibrated with whispers. They called my name, describing my past mistakes, calling them out one by one. I gritted my teeth and refused to stop. My heart thumped. My hands felt cold. I managed to reach the door and swing it open. The night was still, the sky clear. I stood on the porch, sweat on my forehead. The voices stayed inside, echoing in the foyer, but I could hear them faintly even outside. They hissed words I couldn't fully understand. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to drive away and never return. Another part of me felt a strange pull to finish what I started. I sat there for a while, engine off, just staring at the dark shape of the mansion. I could still see the faint glow of my lantern through a window. My arms were tense, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I realized this place wouldn't let me rest until I made a decision. Either I would finish a real cleansing ritual, or I would cut my losses and leave this inheritance behind. I had no idea if the books in my bag contained the right method, but I knew I wasn't prepared to do anything more tonight. My body felt drained, and my mind was on edge. I locked the car, went back inside, and packed my gear. The voices seemed quieter, but I still heard them whisper my name now and then. I found a corner room on the main floor that had fewer vents, and I sat with my back to the wall. I kept the lantern next to me and tried to close my eyes for a few hours. When morning came, I planned to figure out my next move. I didn't know if I would stay or leave, but I knew the mansion wouldn't simply become an ordinary house. Something was rooted in the floors, the walls, and the greenhouse. I had never felt anything like it before, and I wasn't sure if I would ever feel right about it. As I sat there listening to the occasional creak of the old wood, I realized I needed to decide soon. I knew I had to either stand up to whatever was whispering or walk away. My hands shook a bit as I took a final look around. I felt the tension in my neck, and my stomach churned. I set down my backpack, feeling the weight of the books inside. The voices in the vents subsided to a low hiss as if they were waiting for my next move. I gripped the lantern, took a deep breath, and prepared for whatever would come next. I moved into that old house by the marsh because I wanted silence. I was tired of car horns, alarms, and loud neighbors. I wanted my own space, and I didn't care if it was far from everything. The place looked run down, but it was cheap, and I liked the idea of having a big backyard that stretched into the wetlands. The first few days were calm enough. I could hear frogs chirping at night and a breeze passing through tall grass. I felt relieved for a while. But then I started hearing stories from a few locals about strange noises at night. They mentioned guttural sounds that carried through the thick trees and over the stagnant waters. They spoke about a greenish glow in the sky, something that flickered for a moment before fading. Some laughed it off as swamp gas or animal calls, but others whispered that it wasn't so simple. I felt a pit in my stomach whenever I remembered their faces. On the third night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. My sheets were damp with sweat. The air felt heavier than usual and there was no breeze. My house has old windows that never shut properly, so everything outside creeps in, from humidity to insects. That night, though, it wasn't insects that worried me. It was a deep growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. It sounded like it was right behind the back fence, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. I forced myself to lie still and breathe slowly. My heart was beating so hard that I thought it might drown out the noise. For several minutes, I heard nothing else. I sat up in bed, stared at the window, and hoped I'd been dreaming. Then the sound came again, low and rumbling, almost like a distorted hum. I felt goosebumps covering my arms and legs. I told myself it was just a coyote or a stray dog, but I knew that wasn't right. I've heard coyotes before. They whine and yip. This was different. The next morning, I checked the yard for any signs of an animal. I found broken branches near the edge of my property about 10 feet from the fence. The footprints in the mud looked weird. Each had 4 toes that seemed too long, and the impressions were uneven, like the weight distribution was off. I crouched down and touched one of the prints. The mud was still damp, and the shape was deep enough that it couldn't have been made by something light. I felt uneasy, but I wasn't sure what to do. I remember cleaning the sweat off my forehead and glancing over my shoulder. The trees seemed still, but I kept imagining something hidden in the shade, watching me. I decided to explore the swamp. I know it's not the smartest thing to do, but I didn't want to sit around in ignorance. So I wore high rubber boots, an old pair of jeans, and a jacket with plenty of pockets. I grabbed a cheap flashlight and set off in the late afternoon. The marshland was thick with reeds, muddy patches, and pockets of stagnant water. The smell was strong. It reminded me of stale water and wet soil. Each step made a slurping sound. Sometimes I felt the mud pulling at my boots, and I had to jerk my legs free. The mosquitoes were relentless. I kept slapping my neck and arms, but it didn't help much. After about 20 minutes of trudging, I noticed more footprints similar to the ones near my fence. They led deeper into the swamp, so I followed them. At one point, I got stuck in a patch of mud up to my knees. I struggled for a minute, tugging at my boots and bracing myself against the trunk of a fallen tree. I lost track of time, but eventually I freed myself. By then, my heart was pounding and I was covered in sweat. My hands shook. That's when I heard a faint sloshing sound. I stopped and held my breath. It sounded like something moving slowly through the water. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but I couldn't see anything. The tall reeds blocked my view. I stepped forward, trying to be quiet, but the mud kept squishing under me. Suddenly, I saw it. A shape slid between the reeds about 30 feet ahead. It was hunched over with shoulders that looked too wide for its frame. Its arms hung at odd angles, and I saw fingers that seemed elongated and bent. The head was tilted down, and I couldn't make out the face in detail. My first instinct was to freeze. My chest felt tight and my throat went dry. I tried to swallow, but nothing happened. I remember thinking, I need to be calm. If I run, it'll see me. I don't know why that crossed my mind. Maybe I thought it worked like a wild animal. As I stood there, the shape slowly turned its head in my direction. I saw a hint of a face with sunken cheeks and skin that looked pale, almost gray. The creature didn't make any noise that I could hear. I forced myself to take one slow step back. My boots made a little suction sound and the thing twitched. My pulse started racing, and I felt sweat trickle down my temples. I thought about turning and sprinting back to the house, but I was afraid I'd slip. The creature twisted its torso slightly, then moved off through the reeds. I heard a low clicking noise, followed by a faint gurgle. Then it was gone. I stood there for at least a minute, trying to steady my breathing. My hands shook as I clicked the flashlight off to avoid attracting more attention. In the dim light of late afternoon, I could still see enough to walk carefully. I decided to follow the footprints back to my property. I needed time to think. I reached the edge of my yard as dusk settled. My clothes were caked in mud. I hurried inside and locked every door and window. I felt vulnerable, like the walls couldn't keep anything out if it really wanted to come in. That night I tried to sleep early. I kept a small lamp on in the corner of my bedroom. I thought it might help me relax, but I still felt wound up. Around midnight, I heard that growl again, only this time it was closer. It sounded like it was just beyond my backyard. My mouth went dry. My heartbeat felt strong in my ears. I got out of bed and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back an inch. My backyard was dark. I saw a faint glow in the sky, like a pale green flicker. It disappeared after a few seconds. Then I heard a low, raspy exhale. I think it came from near the fence. I clenched my jaw to keep from gasping. My palms were sweaty and I felt a knot in my stomach. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, waiting for another sound. But all I heard was my own breathing and the hum of the ceiling fan. By morning, I was exhausted. My thoughts were jumbled, and I had a headache from the tension. I forced myself to eat some eggs and toast even though my appetite was gone. I kept staring out the kitchen window at the swamp. I needed answers. Maybe someone else in the area had seen it. I decided to drive into town and talk to a local friend named Roy, who ran a small hardware store. He was a straightforward guy. I told him about the footprints and the shape in the reeds. He scratched his beard and looked uneasy. He said he'd heard old stories from some of the older folks in the region. People claimed there was something in the swamps that wasn't quite human, but they never found solid proof. He suggested I stay away from the deeper parts of the marsh after dark. He didn't joke or laugh. He seemed serious, which only made me more anxious. That afternoon, I stood on my back porch with a pair of binoculars. I scanned the tree line, focusing on any spot where the brush looked disturbed. Nothing moved. The air was thick and hot, and a thin layer of sweat covered my neck. I kept thinking about the creature's twisted posture. It had a face, but it wasn't normal. I remembered the odor, too, something like damp seaweed and salt. It lingered in the back of my throat when I inhaled. I felt uneasy being outside, but I also didn't want to stay locked up in the house. I paced around the yard, checking the ground for new footprints. I found a set of tracks that led to the side of my house near a broken window latch. My nerves spiked. I wondered if the creature had tried to get inside the night before. At sunset, I prepared a small fire pit in my backyard. I thought the light might keep whatever was out there at a distance. I lit the fire and dragged an old chair outside. I sat and watched the tree line, occasionally tossing a bit of wood on the flames. Time passed slowly. Crickets chirped, and the frogs started their nightly chorus. Around 11, the air got colder and the wind picked up. I pulled my jacket tighter. The fire crackled and spat. I felt my muscles tense with every noise. Then I saw something move between the tall reeds again. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and shone the beam toward the movement. For a second, I saw those hunched shoulders and long fingers. The eyes reflected the light in a dull, milky glow. My stomach clenched and I felt my heart speed up. The creature stared at me and I sensed hesitation from it. It wasn't approaching. It just watched me for a few moments. My thoughts raced. My chest felt tight and my breathing became shallow. I decided not to move. I just kept the flashlight on it. The creature raised one arm as if shielding its face from the light. Then it let out a soft growl. I tasted bile in my mouth from the fear. My knees felt weak, but I stayed put, gripping the flashlight with both hands. Slowly, the creature slunk backward into the reeds. I stayed there, staring into the darkness, until I realized it was gone. I turned off the flashlight and threw more wood on the fire, trying to calm my nerves. My hands shook so badly that I almost dropped the log. The smell of smoke mixed with my sweat, and I had a throbbing ache at the back of my skull. I went inside around 2 in the morning, too drained to keep watch any longer. I showered in lukewarm water, trying to wash off the stench of the swamp. My muscles felt tight and sore. I flopped onto my bed but couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment when our eyes met. There was something behind those eyes, maybe curiosity or confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was trying to understand me as much as I was trying to understand it. The next day, I walked the perimeter of my property, checking for any broken boards or openings. I noticed fresh prints again, circling around near a window to my living room. The glass had smudges on the outside, like something pressed its face against it. My stomach turned at the thought. I opened the window carefully and found a faint trail of mud along the sill. No damage, but it was enough to make me lock everything. I even dragged a heavy dresser in front of that window. I didn't want any more surprises at night. I couldn't ignore this. It was clear the creature was coming closer. Part of me felt it was searching for something. Maybe it was curious about me, or maybe it wanted something from me. I didn't feel like it was outright hostile, but I couldn't be sure. My instincts told me to be cautious, so I decided on a different approach. I left some food scraps in a plastic container near the fence line before sunset. I wanted to see if it would take the offering. I didn't stand around to watch, though. I retreated inside, shut off my lights, and peeked out from a dark corner. Hours later, close to midnight, I saw movement near the fence. The shape emerged again. It crouched over the container for a few seconds, sniffing or examining it. Then it reached out with those long fingers and took a piece of leftover meat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I heard a soft grunt. My heart thumped against my ribs. I had no idea what might happen next. The creature ate, or at least chewed on the food, then shuffled away into the swamp without looking at the house. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath the entire time. For the next few nights, I repeated the routine. I left a small amount of scraps at the same spot, and each time, the creature showed up. It never made a move toward the house on those nights. It grabbed the food and vanished. My tension remained, but I felt a slight change. I wondered if this was a sign that it only wanted sustenance or some kind of contact, not aggression. Still, I didn't dare approach it directly. I felt a tug in my gut that told me not to push my luck. I'm still living here, and the nights remain unsettling. Sometimes I hear those guttural sounds right behind my fence, accompanied by that weird greenish glow in the sky. I don't know what causes that glow. It reminds me of faint light shining through a bottle, but it disappears so fast that I can't study it. My body tenses up whenever I hear a branch snap or a low grunt. I keep a flashlight handy at all times, and I always watch the swamp from behind my curtains. Each day I wake up with sore shoulders from the stress. My thoughts jump to the possibility of more than one creature out there, but I've only seen one so far. I haven't told many people about this. Roy knows some of it, but he doesn't ask for details. He gave me a shotgun for self-defense, which I keep locked in a cabinet. I'm not proud of feeling so jumpy, but the fear is real. My nights are filled with the heavy quiet of the swamp, broken by the occasional rustle or grunt. My days are spent on edge, waiting for the next sign that something is creeping around my windows. I still don't know what it wants. I don't know if it just needs a place to feed and hide, or if it's sizing me up for something worse. Each time I consider packing up and leaving, I remember how tired I was of the city and how much I longed for a quiet life. This is quiet, but it's not peaceful. I'm stuck here with a creature that looks partly human but twisted. It never speaks, never tries to communicate in a way I understand. It only watches and takes the scraps of food I leave out. I've come to accept that I may never truly figure out its intentions. All I know is that I have to respect its territory and hope it respects mine. At least it hasn't broken into the house or attacked me. But every night, before I close my eyes, I think about those footprints and that hunched figure slinking into the swamp. My stomach coils with a mix of dread and curiosity. I wonder if it's lonely out there, or if it's planning something that I can't imagine. Either way, I keep my doors locked, my flashlight ready, and my senses on high alert. This is my home now, and that thing is out there somewhere, breathing in the dark. I noticed the mirror right away because it had these ugly shapes carved into its frame, and the glass itself looked stained with rust around the edges. It was late afternoon, and the antique shop was about to close. The place smelled like old cardboard and damp wood, and I didn't want to stay there long. But I felt this urge to take a closer look. The shop owner was bored. He mumbled a price, and I didn't bother to haggle. I just paid him and carried the mirror out to my car. I remember the way the chipped gold paint on the frame scraped against my arm as I loaded it into the trunk. It was heavier than it looked. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of an old building. The place isn't much. The paint on the walls is faded and the windows rattle when trucks pass on the street. I never bothered to decorate. I have a bed, a dresser, a small couch, and a bookshelf. But that day, I felt like changing something. I thought maybe the mirror would make the space feel bigger or brighter. The store was almost empty when I walked in, and the item looked like it might fall apart if I left it there. I don't usually buy random junk, but I didn't think too hard about it. When I got home, I had to carry the mirror up the narrow staircase. The stairs creaked under my feet, and the mirror's frame dug into my palms. I banged my shoulder against the door frame, and the glass rattled. I was afraid it might crack right there, but it stayed intact. My heart was beating fast and my arms were shaking from the weight. I finally got inside, leaned it against the living room wall for a moment, and rubbed my palms to get the blood flowing. Tiny flecks of rust rubbed off on my fingers. I wiped my hands on my jeans and decided I'd hang it in the bedroom. I used a stud finder and a heavy-duty hook. The mirror wasn't huge, but it felt denser than regular glass. I struggled with the alignment. I wanted it straight and I used a level, but it always seemed off. After a few tries, I managed to get it looking somewhat level. When I stepped back, I realized the frame had these carved faces on each corner. They didn't look friendly. They reminded me of gargoyles, but more twisted. Some parts looked like scales or wings. It gave me a small chill, but I shrugged it off. I figured it was just old craftsmanship. That first night, I was tired. I brushed my teeth, climbed into bed, and turned off the lights. The moonlight from the window reflected in the mirror, and it gave the room a weird glow. The bed is positioned so that the mirror is on the wall to my right. If I turn my head, I can see it. I remember looking at it before I dozed off. I couldn't make out my own reflection, just a dark outline, but I noticed the outline seemed to flicker. It might have been my tired eyes. I closed them and drifted to sleep. In the morning, I woke up with a stiff neck. I glanced at the mirror and it looked normal in the daylight. The rust around the edges was more noticeable, but I didn't see anything else strange. I got dressed, went to work, came home later. I had some leftover pizza, watched a show on my laptop, then went to the bedroom to get changed. As I was pulling off my shirt, I caught something in the mirror. It looked like a shadow behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My chest felt tight. I glanced at the mirror again, but the shadow was gone. I told myself it was my own reflection, maybe a trick of the light. I tried to act calm, but I felt on edge. I left the room for a while and got a glass of water. When I came back, I avoided looking at the mirror. I turned off the overhead lamp and settled in with a small reading light on my nightstand. I felt uncomfortable. My eyes kept drifting toward the mirror. Every time I looked, I expected to see something, but I never caught it again that night. Over the next few days, I saw more of these glimpses. Once, I saw a shape crouched near the foot of my bed in the reflection. When I jerked my head around, nothing was there. Another time I saw something near the bedroom door, like a long, thin figure. I even jumped out of bed and flicked the light switch, ready to swing at whatever it was. but there was no one. I started to feel paranoid. I kept checking my locks, my windows, and my closet. Everything was normal, but that mirror always felt like it was hiding something. It gave me a stomachache just thinking about it. I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself that I was tired or stressed, or maybe there was a glare causing illusions. But then the cracks appeared. At first, it was just one small line near the top right corner. I only noticed it because it caught the light in a strange way when I walked past. I ran my finger over it. I felt a slight ridge, but it didn't look like it went all the way through the glass. I thought maybe I'd knocked it somehow. The next morning, I saw another crack. This one stretched down from the left side. I hadn't touched the mirror, and the building wasn't shaking or anything, so I couldn't explain it. The cracks looked new, and they formed these thin, jagged paths across the surface. They almost reminded me of spider legs, but I'm not trying to be poetic. They were just lines branching out in random directions. I tried pressing on the glass to see if it was loose, but it held firm. My fingertips felt a slight vibration, but that could have been my nerves. Every time I found a new crack, I noticed more shadows. The shapes in the reflection got bolder. I started seeing outlines that looked like people, but also not quite human. I could see movements out of the corner of my eye. Whenever I spun around, the room was empty. My breathing would get heavy and I'd feel a rush of blood in my ears. My heart would pound and sometimes I'd catch myself shaking for no reason. I stopped sleeping well. I'd wake up in a sweat. Sure, I'd heard whispers or soft footsteps, but I never saw anything when I turned on the light. After about a week, I decided to find out more about the mirror. I went back to the antique shop, but the owner wasn't very helpful. He just shrugged and said he got it from some estate sale. He didn't remember the name of the previous owner. I checked online, searching for antique mirrors with weird frames. I found a few references to old handmade pieces that came from private collectors. Some articles mentioned mirrors used in ritual practices, but a lot of that stuff seemed like rumors. Still, it got me thinking. I tried to see if the carvings on the corners matched any known symbols. I found some images that looked similar, involving strange figures from old folklore, but none of it gave me a clear answer. I felt stuck. Meanwhile, the cracks spread. I'd wake up and see a new one snaking across the glass. The reflections got darker, like the background behind me was covered in shadows. Sometimes I thought I saw faces in those shadows. They looked distorted. Their mouths would twitch, and their eyes seemed to follow me. I'd get chills on my arms. My chest would feel tight, and I'd try to shake off the panic. I never found anyone in my apartment, though. I double-checked every nook and cranny, but no one was there. One night, I sat on my bed and stared at the mirror for a long time. I wanted to see if I could catch something in real time. It was around 2 a.m., and the lights were off except for a small lamp in the corner. I watched my own reflection for a while. My eyes were bloodshot, and my hair was messy. The cracks in the glass gave my reflection a shattered look. It felt unsettling. Then I heard a soft scraping sound. It was like nails tapping on glass. It came from the mirror, or at least that's how it seemed. I leaned forward, listening hard. My heart was beating like crazy. The sound stopped. I got up and I touched the frame. The carving of a twisted creature on the top seemed rough under my fingertips. I felt a slight warmth, which didn't make sense. The metal parts were cold, but the wooden parts felt warm. I heard a creak from inside the wall. I pulled my hand away, startled, but I told myself it was just an old building noise. My breath felt shallow, and my palms were sweaty. I wiped them on my shirt and tried to stay calm. The next day, I called a friend who deals in antiques, but he mostly knows about furniture, not weird mirrors. He said I should just get rid of it if it's creeping me out. I thought about throwing it in the dumpster, but I hesitated. The cracks looked like they were forming a pattern. I couldn't be sure, but they seemed to converge near the center. Something about that made me cautious. I worried that if I threw it away, maybe someone else would find it, or maybe it wouldn't let go of me so easily. I don't know how to explain that thought. It just felt like a bad idea to toss it and walk away. That evening, I saw an article online about old mirrors involved in rituals. It mentioned that some people believed mirrors could trap images and channel forces from another plane. It sounded crazy, but I couldn't dismiss it. The article warned about breaking such mirrors. It claimed that destroying them could release whatever was inside. I wasn't sure I believed any of it, but I felt a knot in my stomach. I decided to keep investigating. I managed to track down a guy who ran a small museum of oddities. He said he'd heard of a mirror with monstrous engravings used in secret gatherings. He couldn't confirm much, but he said something about manipulation of images and entities that exist between reflections. He talked like he believed in this stuff. I listened, but I felt uneasy. He said if it was the same mirror, there might have been rituals involving the reflection as a gateway. I couldn't tell if he was legit or just making it up. He recommended sealing the mirror or locking it away. He also said that if the mirror had started to crack on its own, it might be linked to whatever those rituals had awakened. I hung up the phone and felt a rush of anxiety. My legs were shaky. I paced around my apartment. By now, the mirror had at least 4 or 5 major cracks, all branching in different directions. The glass still held together, but the lines formed a bizarre web. Every time I looked at it, I felt like something was looking back. I wanted to tear it off the wall, but I was scared of what might happen if I did, so I tried ignoring it. I ate dinner, watched some mindless TV, then went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint tapping noises. Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom. When I passed the mirror, my reflection looked strange. My eyes in the mirror seemed darker than normal, and the background behind me looked like it was moving, like there was a shape shifting back there. My stomach clenched, and I felt sweat run down my back. I thought I saw a hand reach toward me from the reflection. I jumped sideways, almost tripping over my own feet. The reflection went back to normal. At that point, I decided I had to do something. I grabbed a thick blanket from the closet and threw it over the mirror. I pinned the edges to the wall with push pins to keep it covered. Then I tried to go back to bed. The tapping continued, but it was muffled. I lay there with my eyes open, feeling my heart pound. My mouth was dry and I kept swallowing hard. I finally drifted off in the early morning. When the sun came up, I went online and tried to find a place that might handle weird objects. There are a few shops that deal with occult artifacts, but none of them seemed trustworthy. I kept circling around the same question. Do I get rid of it or confront it? The museum guy had mentioned sealing it, but he didn't explain how. I walked into my bedroom and looked at the covered mirror. The blanket had fallen slightly, showing the top corner and one of those carved heads. I could see the cracks below the cloth, and for a second, I thought they had spread again. I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I decided to face it. I pulled the blanket down. The mirror was the same as before, maybe with an extra hairline crack near the bottom. I said out loud, "Enough of this." My voice sounded shaky. I reached for the frame. It felt warm again, and my arm hair stood on end. I lifted the mirror off the wall. My arms shook under the weight. I carried it to the living room and leaned it carefully against a bare section of wall next to the couch. I stepped back and stared at it. My reflection stared back at me. It didn't move on its own, but the cracks gave me a distorted image. I felt goosebumps rising on my arms. It seemed like the shapes in the background were there again, swirling near the edges. I thought about smashing the glass, but the memory of that article saying it could release something made me pause. I stood there breathing hard, my hands sweating on the mirror's sides. The tapping started again, faint but steady. It was like something was knocking from the other side. I could see my reflection's mouth pressed into a thin line. My jaw felt tense and my teeth were clenched. I let out a sharp breath. I'm still standing here, deciding what to do next. If I break it, I might unleash something. If I throw it away, maybe it'll come back or pass the problem on to someone else. If I keep it, the cracks will keep growing and those shapes will keep appearing. I can feel them watching me even now. My skin feels cold and my chest is tight. The mirror sits against the wall and I can't look away. I'm stuck and I know I have to make a move soon. My head is spinning. My throat feels dry. I keep telling myself to do something, but I'm not sure if I should face whatever's inside or try to lock it away. I guess I'm about to find out one way or another. I rented this cabin because I thought I'd finally get a break. My job had been wearing me down for months, and I wanted some time to breathe. I saw a listing for a small wooden place right by the ocean, with no neighbors around for miles. It seemed like the perfect getaway. I booked it, packed my truck with groceries and a few clothes, and drove several hours out of the city. The moment I arrived, I realized it was more isolated than I expected. There was a narrow, uneven path that led to the front steps, and I noticed an old, deactivated lighthouse standing tall a few hundred yards away on a rocky outcrop. The thing looked abandoned, but that night, I saw it glow in the darkness. It made no sense. There was no power supply connected to it. That was my first sign something wasn't normal here. I'll start from the beginning. The day I got here, it was late afternoon. The sky was clear, and a cool wind blew through the dunes. I parked on a small patch of dirt that served as a makeshift driveway. No one else was around. The cabin had basic furniture, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a battered couch, and a small bed in a corner. There was also a tiny kitchenette with a sink, a stove, and a fridge. It all smelled a bit musty, like it had been sitting empty for a while. A single window faced the ocean, giving me a direct view of the water and the lighthouse. I dropped my stuff on the bed and opened the fridge to check if it worked. The power hummed, so it was on. The place had a generator out back, and I remembered the listing saying it had limited capacity, so I tried to conserve energy. I stored my groceries, then decided to head outside before it got dark. The ocean called to me. I needed some fresh air, so I walked along the beach for about 20 minutes. The sand felt cold under my boots. The sun was going down, and I felt a moment of calm. I closed my eyes, listened to the waves. The tension in my chest loosened a bit. When I turned back, I glanced at the lighthouse. The top of it was dark. I expected that. Nobody said it was functioning. But the structure looked eerie with chipped paint, a rusted railing, and a slight lean. I thought about the safety hazards. If it had been a historical site, maybe someone would have restored it. But it stood alone, about 30 feet tall with no fences around it. I planned to check it out another day, but I didn't feel any real hurry. That first night, I heated some soup on the stove and ate it in silence. I kept the lights off inside to watch the moon's reflection on the water through the window. That's when I noticed the lighthouse glowing. At first, it was a faint flicker. I squinted, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the dark. Then it intensified, a steady beam of pale light sweeping across the sea. I felt a jolt in my stomach. My mouth went dry. The hair on my arms stood up. I thought, that's impossible. There was no caretaker, no electricity running to it. Yet there it was, shining across the waves. I didn't have any explanation. My chest tightened. I took a step closer to the window. I kept staring, waiting for the light to fade. It didn't. I felt uneasy. My mind raced, trying to figure out a logical reason. Maybe a generator was hidden inside. Maybe somebody else was messing around. I decided I'd look in the morning. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. My thoughts wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the lighthouse's beam passing over the water. I also felt something odd, like someone was standing near me. I opened my eyes more than once, expecting to see a figure in the corner of the room. I heard small creaks in the walls. It's an old cabin, so it's normal for wood to shift, but this felt different. My heart pounded. I told myself to calm down. Eventually, I drifted off. But my dreams were restless. I woke up early the next day. The sunlight filtered through the window. My neck felt stiff. I walked outside to stretch and check the surroundings. The lighthouse looked like a normal abandoned tower again. No trace of the strange glow. I put on a heavier jacket because the ocean breeze was chilly. Then I followed a rough path of stones toward the lighthouse. I climbed over some jagged rocks to get close to the base. The paint was peeling. revealing layers of old white and red. The door looked locked with rust around the knob. I jiggled it. It wouldn't budge. I circled around the foundation. The lighthouse stood on a concrete platform. I noticed small cracks here and there, but no clear entrance other than the front door. I wanted to see inside, but I lacked the tools to force the lock without damaging the property. I decided to walk around the area. There was a small shack behind the lighthouse, maybe used for storage at some point. Its roof was half collapsed. Inside, I found a few rotted pieces of furniture, a couple of empty boxes, and an old book in one corner. It was partially buried in sand, edges bitten by moisture. I picked it up. The cover was blank, just a brown leather surface. I brushed off the sand. The pages were yellowed and had a strange smell, like old seaweed. There were scribbles on the first page, notes in a language I didn't fully recognize. But then further in, the text switched to English. It mentioned the year 1926. There were entries talking about sightings of creatures near the shore. The writer described them as twisted figures that rise from the depths when the light is on. This confused me. I skimmed more pages, but I didn't grasp the full context. Some lines suggested these creatures had features like humans, but with slick skin and large eyes. Other lines mentioned footprints on the beach that disappeared by morning. I felt my pulse quicken. This was too strange. It read like a journal from someone who might have been delusional or paranoid. Still, it rattled me. I slid the book into my jacket pocket, figuring I'd read it more thoroughly back at the cabin. Walking away, I tried to keep my mind steady, telling myself it was just some old fantasy. I headed back, started a pot of coffee, and sat at the small table to read. The entries were messy, filled with frantic writing. The person who kept the journal noted that the lighthouse attracted these figures when it lit up. It said that even though it was deactivated, sometimes it glowed on its own, and that signaled something in the ocean. I couldn't ignore that I saw the lighthouse glow last night. My heart hammered. My head felt tight. I kept reading. There were references to fleeting shadows on the beach and the feeling of not being alone. The last pages showed drawings of humanoid silhouettes near the water, next to the lighthouse, sometimes on the rocks. Then the entries ended abruptly. No date, no final note, just blank pages. I closed the book and stared at the cabin's wall. My stomach churned. I didn't like this. I wanted to brush it off as local legend, but it matched what I saw. I told myself I'd stay rational. Night came again. I tried to distract myself by cooking an actual meal this time. I made pasta and ate it in silence. The wind whipped around outside. I heard the waves crashing harder than before. The cabin lights flickered. I remembered the generator wasn't reliable. Then I glanced toward the window. The lighthouse was lit again, a bright beam sweeping across the dark sea. I felt my chest get tight. I got up, walked to the window, and pressed my hand against the glass. Goosebumps covered my arms. I started hearing a faint sound like whispers carried by the wind. It came in waves, in sync with the crashing surf. I strained my ears to catch actual words, but it was more like a low murmur. My breathing got shallow. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside. The cold air hit me. The moon was high, reflecting on the water. The sound of the waves felt louder. I heard another series of whispers. They seemed to come from the direction of the lighthouse, but they also felt everywhere at once. I walked a bit closer to the shore, scanning the sand with my flashlight. I saw nothing but wet footprints. I followed them for a few steps until they vanished near the rocks. My eyes started playing tricks on me. I thought I saw movement near the lighthouse, a dark shape against the rocky base. My heart pounded. I aimed the flashlight, but it only lit a small circle in the distance. Then I heard a noise behind me, like something shifting on the rocks. I spun around, but there was just the open beach. My breathing got heavier. I told myself to get back inside. I wasn't going to investigate unarmed alone at night. I made it back to the cabin, locked the door, and shut the windows. I sat on the couch with the flashlight in my lap, feeling my heart still racing. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured those footprints. The presence felt stronger now. I kept hearing small creaks outside, or maybe on the roof. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off. I woke up at sunrise with a sore neck. I checked outside. The beach was empty except for scattered seaweed. I decided I had to open that lighthouse door. I wanted answers, or at least some closure. If I could show myself the interior was just an empty tower, maybe I'd calm down. That morning I drove to the nearest town. It was about 45 minutes away. I found a small hardware store. I bought a crowbar and a sturdy hammer. The store clerk gave me a suspicious look when I asked for them, probably thinking I had some shady plan. I just told him I needed to do repairs at my cabin. On the way back, I felt a gnawing anxiety in my stomach. My palms were sweaty on the steering wheel. When I got back, I wasted no time. I walked straight to the lighthouse. I tested the door again, still locked. The wood was damp and splintered. I wedged the crowbar in and pushed. The door resisted. I leaned in with my shoulder, giving it a solid shove. The rusted lock broke with a snap, and the door swung open, releasing a stale smell of salt and decay. I pointed my flashlight inside. The interior was cramped. There was a spiral staircase hugging the wall. Each step looked rusty, with flakes of old paint. I stepped in slowly, my boots scraping on the concrete floor. The air felt thick and stagnant. I saw a few pieces of old furniture against the walls, a rickety chair, a small table, a broken lantern. I kept moving, circling up the staircase. Every step made a grating sound. My chest felt tight. My mouth was dry. Near the top, I found a small room that housed the old mechanism for the lighthouse's beacon. It was all rusted. I saw no functioning equipment, no power cables, nothing that could produce light. The lens was cracked, the interior dusty. Cobwebs hung in the corners. I traced my hand over the broken controls. All of it seemed dead. Yet at night, it glowed. This made no sense. I felt my heart thumping. I was sweating even though it was cold up there. I checked every inch, but I didn't find anything that explained the light. Then I heard a sound down below, like something scraping the floor. I froze, holding the flashlight tight. My pulse hammered in my ears. I listened. It was a dragging noise, then silence. I waited, trying not to move. My breathing was shallow and fast. Then I heard a light tap on the stair railing. I shone my flashlight down the stairwell. Nothing but swirling dust in the beam. I stayed still, waiting. My legs shook a bit. I told myself it might be the wind, but the door was closed and there was no breeze inside. I realized I was cornered. If there was someone or something there, I had no exit except down those stairs. I forced myself to move, step by step. I held the crowbar in my free hand. My boots made a dull thump on the metal steps. My heart pounded harder. When I reached the bottom, I swept my flashlight around. Nothing. The door stood partially open, letting in a crack of daylight. I stepped out onto the rocks. The waves crashed in the distance. It took me a few seconds to catch my breath. My head was pounding. I hurried back to the cabin, feeling like something might be watching me. Inside, I locked the door and closed the curtains. My hands shook. I checked the old diary again. The entries talked about hearing whispers, seeing silhouettes. I turned the pages more carefully this time, scanning for anything I might have missed. There was a mention of certain nights being more active than others. The writer said these creatures grew bolder when the moon was bright. I glanced at the calendar on my phone. A full moon was only 2 days away. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. By the time night fell again, I was on edge. Every noise outside made me tense up. The wind rattled the cabin's walls. I could hear the distant rumble of waves. I checked the window. Sure enough, the lighthouse was lit again, the beam moving across the darkness. I turned off all my lights. I didn't want to attract attention. I sat quietly by the window, just peering through a small gap in the curtain. After an hour, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. That's when I noticed shadows on the beach. They looked like human figures, but their motions were slow and jerky. They were right at the water's edge. My stomach twisted. I counted 3 of them. They seemed to be searching, scanning the shoreline. My breath caught in my throat. Suddenly, I saw one of those shapes move closer to the rocks that led to the lighthouse. It climbed with an awkward gait. Another followed. The third lingered near the water. I felt sweat trickling down my temple. My heart thumped so hard I thought it would burst. I ducked away from the window, afraid they might sense me watching. My mind raced with questions. Could they get in? Were they hostile? The diary suggested they only appeared when the light was on, and they mostly stayed near the water. But I remembered the mention of them climbing onto land, looking for something. I kept my head low. My chest felt tight. The minutes passed, dragging on. I heard the wind, the faint sound of the lighthouse's beam rotating, and my own breathing. Now and then, I forced myself to peek outside. I saw the figures on the rocks hunched over as if examining the lighthouse's base. Another time, they were gone. Then I spotted them near a large boulder closer to the cabin. I yanked the curtain shut and pressed my back against the wall. My hands trembled. I clenched them into fists, trying to stop the shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I waited until dawn. When the first light of morning appeared, I cautiously opened the door. Nothing but a calm beach remained. I checked for footprints. I found several lines in the sand leading from the water to the rocks, but they disappeared into the wet patches. My heart was still racing. My mouth felt dry. I didn't know how much longer I could handle this. That evening, things escalated. I decided to keep all the lights off again. I sat in the dark with my flashlight. The lighthouse beam glowed as usual, cutting across the night sky. Sometime around midnight, I heard scraping against the side of the cabin. It sounded like claws dragging along the wood. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the crowbar. My breathing felt labored. Another scrape, this time near the window. I forced myself to look. I tugged the curtain just a bit. My knees went weak. There was a silhouette pressed against the glass, large round eyes peering in. The skin looked shiny, dripping with water. I staggered back, biting my tongue to keep from shouting. I heard a low sound like a gurgling gasp. The silhouette vanished from the window. Then I heard quick steps around the side of the cabin. I braced myself, holding the crowbar tight. My pulse hammered. I locked eyes with the door, ready to swing if anything pushed it open. The door rattled once. My stomach clenched so hard it hurt. Then it stopped. I stood there, holding my breath. My heart kept pounding. A few moments later, I heard shuffling footsteps in the distance, then quiet. I waited until sunrise again before I dared to check outside. My eyes were sunken. I hadn't slept. The beach was empty, just the cold wind blowing across the sand. I saw deep grooves by the cabin wall where the scraping had happened. It left a series of marks as if claws or long nails had dragged across the wood. My entire body felt shaky. I knew I couldn't continue like this. The diary said these things manifested when the lighthouse was lit. The light came on every night. I had no clue how to turn it off. The mechanism inside was rusted and inert, yet it still glowed. Now I'm thinking about leaving. Actually, I've already thrown my bags into the truck. I haven't seen them in daylight, and I don't want to face them tonight. I don't have an answer for that damn lighthouse. I checked inside it. There's no working machinery. Yet it glows every evening, and those creatures come out. I feel tension in my shoulders, and my stomach still churns. I keep expecting to see a figure at the edge of my vision. I'm about to lock this cabin and never come back. The rental period isn't over, but I don't care. I came here to find peace, but I found something else. Something I don't understand. I can't sleep here anymore. I can't stand the whispering and the clawing and the glow. I can't explain it, and nobody in town would believe me if I tried. That's all I have to say. I'm leaving this place. The lighthouse can keep its secret, and I'll keep my sanity. If anyone ever rents this cabin after me, I hope they stay away from that lighthouse at night. I hope they leave before the full moon. Because once that light shines, you won't feel alone out here. And that's not a good thing. I walked into the inn with a restless feeling in my stomach. The sign outside was cracked, the paint flaking off in thin chips. A single light over the entrance flickered. I had to stay here for a few weeks because of a work project in this historic town. I didn't have many lodging options, and the price for this place was surprisingly low. The manager, an older man with thick glasses, checked me in. He mumbled about the corridors and the old wings of the inn, but he didn't explain much. I remember feeling a chill the moment I stepped into my room. The air was stale, and it smelled like old books and damp walls. My room was on the second floor, at the end of a narrow hallway. The wallpaper was peeling in several spots, and the carpet made a squishing sound under my shoes. I dropped my bag next to the bed and looked around. There was a small window that faced a courtyard full of weeds and broken chairs. I noticed a heavy wooden wardrobe with squeaking doors whenever I opened or closed them. The bed looked clean enough, though the mattress felt lumpy when I sat on it. I was exhausted, so I decided to sleep right away. However, something kept me awake. Maybe it was the constant flicker of the corridor light that shone under my door, or maybe it was just nerves about being in a strange place. The next morning I woke up feeling stiff. My back hurt from the hard mattress. I went downstairs to see if there was any breakfast, but I only found an empty dining room. A few plates and cups were stacked on a dusty table. The manager was nowhere to be found. I checked the time on my phone. It was around 7:30 a.m. I decided to walk around the inn to see if there was any sign of other guests. I passed several closed doors. Some looked like they hadn't been opened in a long time. At the far end of the first floor hallway, I noticed a single light bulb that flickered more intensely than the others. The corridor beyond that light was dark and smelled like something moldy. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should enter. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. As I walked down that corridor, the smell of old wood and wet stone grew stronger. The flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, and I noticed some writing etched into the peeling paint. It looked like initials and dates, as if people had carved them many decades ago. The corridor turned left and then opened into what looked like a forgotten wing of the inn. There were a few doors on each side, all closed. The floor creaked with every step, and I kept expecting someone to pop out and ask me what I was doing. I reached the end of that wing and saw a small landing with a window that was covered in grime. Suddenly I heard a faint buzzing noise like electric wires malfunctioning. The light overhead started to flicker more violently. I felt my heart rate spike. My eyes adjusted to the dim surroundings, and I noticed the dust swirling around me. I felt a wave of cold air pass by. It was so sudden that I shivered. Then I heard soft voices, like whispers. I turned around, but no one was there. The corridor behind me seemed longer than before. My chest felt tight. I walked back toward the main hallway, but something felt off. The walls looked different, like the wallpaper had changed color. The doors along the corridor had older hinges and different doorknobs. I saw a woman standing at one of the doors. She was dressed in a long skirt and a high-collared blouse. Her hair was pinned up in a style that looked old-fashioned, almost like something from a history book. She was speaking to a man wearing suspenders and a vest. I couldn't understand their words. It sounded like an archaic form of the local language. Their voices were muted, as if coming through a wall. They glanced at me but didn't react. I stood there, not sure what to do. My heart pounded in my ears. I tried to approach them, but the corridor light behind me flickered again and I felt the cold air pushing at my back. I stepped backward, and suddenly the corridor changed. The wallpaper returned to its peeled state, and the people vanished. I stood there in shock, my breathing unsteady. I rubbed my eyes and tried to slow my breathing. My hands were sweating. I had no idea what had just happened. There was no one else in the hallway now. It looked deserted and neglected, just like when I first entered. I hurried back to the lobby. It was empty, with the same dusty couches and an old reception desk. I stared at the front door. The morning sun was still shining through the glass. It felt like I had stepped into another time for a moment and then snapped back. I went outside to get some fresh air. The chilly morning breeze hit my face. I stood there on the porch, questioning my sanity. Was I hallucinating? Was I sleep deprived? By late afternoon, I couldn't shake off the memory of what I saw. I kept replaying the sight of those people in old-fashioned clothes. I decided to go back and see if it would happen again. My curiosity overrode my fear. The manager was sitting behind the reception desk, looking through some receipts. I asked him about the corridor in the back. He shrugged and said it was just an old wing they barely used. I asked if there were any guests back there. He said no, not in years. I went upstairs to my room to drop off some things. Then I quietly returned to that flickering corridor on the first floor. The sun was starting to set, and the light in that hallway was even weaker now. The floor groaned beneath my weight as I walked, and the musty smell made me breathe through my mouth. I reached the same spot as before, near the little window at the end. The buzzing noise started up again. This time it was louder. My palms began to sweat, and I felt goosebumps on my arms. The overhead light flickered rapidly. For a few seconds, everything went dark. When the light came back, I saw different furniture in the corridor. The walls looked freshly painted. I heard muffled voices behind the doors. One door was ajar, and I saw a man with a handlebar mustache reading a newspaper at a small table. An oil lamp burned next to him. He glanced at me for a second and went back to his paper. My heart thumped so hard I felt it in my throat. I wanted to ask him where I was, but no words came out. I took a few steps forward, and the wood under my feet felt solid and well-maintained, not creaky like before. The flickering light was gone. Instead, there were a few candle sconces on the walls. Everything smelled like polished wood and burning wax. I heard the clink of cups or dishes somewhere down the hall. I walked slowly, afraid that a sudden movement would break the spell. In my head, I wondered if this was a trick. I tried pinching my arm. It hurt. This felt real. I kept going until I reached what looked like a lobby, but it wasn't the same one. There was a front desk, but it was a simple wooden stand with ledgers on top. I saw a couple of people chatting near a fireplace. Their voices were low, and the language was that same archaic one I heard earlier. They wore boots and formal jackets. I just stood there, feeling my legs shaking. Then one of them turned and noticed me. He frowned like I was out of place. I stumbled backward. Suddenly, the overhead light flickered again. I blinked, and the scene changed in an instant. The corridor was back to its ruined state. The wooden stand was gone, replaced by the worn-down reception desk I recognized. The fireplace was cold and filled with trash. The people were nowhere to be seen. I heard my own breathing echo in the stillness. I ran back to the main area, my body tense. My hands were shaking. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about that strange phenomenon. I ventured into the corridor almost every evening to see if it would happen again. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But each time it happened, I noticed more details. I saw guests in old attire, speaking in that outdated language. I smelled tobacco and candle wax. I felt the temperature shift from cold to warm. Then, when the light flickered, I returned to the present, with dusty walls and broken furniture. One night after returning to my room, I heard something scratching at my door. I opened it, but the hallway was empty. There was a faint handprint on the wall opposite my door. It glowed for a second, then disappeared. My stomach lurched. I shut the door and locked it. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing faint footsteps outside, like someone pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but my body was tense. My breathing was shallow. I stared at the ceiling until sunrise. The following day, I found smudges on the walls near the corridor entrance. They looked like streaks of ash or soot. I touched one of them, and it felt cold, almost like a patch of ice. My fingertips tingled. I wiped them on my pants and hurried away. I told the manager about strange marks on the walls. He nodded as if he'd heard it before, but he didn't offer any explanation. He just said, "This place is old. Maybe it's just mold," and went back to his receipts. That evening, I took a flashlight and walked the corridor again. The electricity in that wing was unreliable. Half the time, the bulb wouldn't turn on at all. I wanted to see if I could record something on my phone, maybe prove I wasn't imagining it. As I passed each door, I heard faint echoes, like old conversations repeating in a loop. My flashlight beam caught dust motes floating around. Then I reached the end of the hallway. The overhead light flickered again, and I felt that familiar jolt, like stepping through a cold curtain. In front of me, the corridor transformed again. I saw oil lamps on the walls. My phone died instantly, the screen going black even though it was fully charged. I felt my heart race. I heard distant music like a violin. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the wing. I walked toward it, seeing a large door I hadn't noticed before. It was carved with ornate patterns. I tried the handle, and it creaked open. Inside was a sitting room with chairs arranged in a circle. A man was playing the violin, and a few people were watching him quietly. They turned to look at me. Their faces were pale, and their eyes seemed to shine in the lamplight. My chest felt tight. I backed out of the room, feeling like I was intruding on something private. My foot hit a loose floorboard. I stumbled. One of them stood up and reached a hand toward me. I didn't know what he wanted. My back bumped into the corridor wall and the lights flickered. I blinked. When I looked back into the room, it was empty. The furniture was covered with tattered sheets. A thick layer of dust coated everything. No one was there. I coughed from the sudden smell of rot and neglect. I shined my flashlight around. In the corner, I saw a faint shape flicker, almost like a silhouette. It lingered for a moment and then faded away. I felt fear gripping my chest. I rushed out of the corridor, practically running to my room. My heart was racing and sweat dripped down my face. I locked my door and sat on the bed, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. That night, the scratching noises returned. Soft, slow scratches like nails on wood. They circled around my room, moving from wall to wall. I paced the floor, listening. I considered leaving the inn altogether, but I wasn't sure I could afford a different place for the next few weeks. Plus, a strange curiosity kept me there. I wanted answers, no matter how unsettling they might be. The next morning, I noticed new marks on the corridor walls. They looked like footprints, but the outlines were faint, almost translucent. They led from the end of the corridor toward my room. My stomach flipped when I realized they stopped right in front of my door. I checked under the carpet, wondering if there was some kind of leak or weird damage that caused this. But the floorboards were intact. The manager brushed me off again, muttering something about old pipes and paint stains. I didn't believe him. Every time I entered that corridor, I felt like I was being watched. Sometimes I saw fleeting movements at the corners of my vision. Other times, I heard muffled footsteps or hushed voices. Each time the flickering happened, I ended up in that earlier version of the inn, and I saw more details from that time period. It felt like a complete, functioning place with guests and staff. Then, when I returned to the present, I felt someone or something was coming back with me. The marks on the walls got bolder, and sometimes I caught glimpses of shapes that drifted around corners. One evening, I stepped into the corridor with my flashlight. The bulb overhead was completely burned out, so I relied on my own light. As soon as I reached the halfway point, the flashlight started flickering. Then it went out. I smacked it with my palm. Nothing. I tried my phone light, but my phone died again, even though I had charged it. I stood there in total darkness, my pulse hammering. Slowly, the corridor light came on, flickering in that sickly way. I looked around and saw faint outlines of people. Their forms wavered like static. They moved toward me. I could hear quiet mumbling like voices overlapping. I felt my chest tighten. Then the overhead light glowed more steadily, and for a split second, I saw them clearly. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces expressionless. Behind them, I saw the decayed corridor walls of the present. It was like both times were overlapping. My mind reeled. I stepped back, but my foot hit something solid. I turned and saw one of those figures standing inches from me. Its eyes were dark. A chill shot through my body. My ears rang. I stumbled forward, trying to escape. The corridor lights flickered again. When they steadied, the figures were gone. I was alone, but I felt a heavy presence in the air. I ran to my room, fumbled with the key, and slammed the door behind me. My heart pounded so loudly I thought I might pass out. I stood there, leaning against the door, breathing hard. For the rest of that night, I heard faint knocks on my walls. Sometimes I thought I heard someone saying my name, but the voice was too soft to be certain. I kept all the lights on in my room, though they flickered occasionally. I refused to look out into the hallway. By the next morning, I saw more strange handprints on the corridor walls. They had a faint glow, like a smudge of light. They led right to the staircase going upstairs. I refused to follow them. I decided then that I would pack up and leave as soon as I could. On my final day at the inn, I grabbed my things and headed down to the lobby. It was early, around 6 a.m., and the lobby was empty. I left my key on the reception desk and didn't bother trying to find the manager. I just wanted to get out. I could still feel the tension in the air, like the place was watching me. As I walked out the door, the single light over the entrance flickered once more, casting a quick shadow across the courtyard. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove away, trying not to look back at that old building. Even as I left the property, I felt like something was lingering behind me. My rearview mirror felt too dark. I tried to focus on the road. My stomach churned with a mix of relief and lingering dread. I promised myself I would never stay in a place like that again. But even now, when I close my eyes, I sometimes see those flickering lights and hear those muffled voices. I can still feel that cold air brushing against my neck, reminding me that I brought something back from that corridor. I don't know if it stayed in the inn or followed me. I just know that I still wake up sometimes, expecting to see those faint handprints on my bedroom wall. And when I do, my heart races all over again. I remember the moment I walked into that old house for the first time. I felt a cold draft against my neck the instant I stepped through the door. The floors creaked like they hadn't been touched in ages. I didn't have any real expectations about how my life would go from that day forward. I just knew I was done with my old job, my old apartment, and my old routines. I wanted quiet. I wanted solitude. But when I think back on that first evening, I realize I wasn't prepared for what I'd find in the attic. I wasn't prepared for that clock. And I never expected how everything would change once I heard its chime echo through the house. I decided to move out to the countryside because I felt drained all the time. My life in the city had become repetitive. Wake up, drink coffee, commute, work, come home, watch TV, sleep. That was it. I was sick of it. I found a real estate listing for a small rustic house about an hour outside town. It was cheap, had no immediate neighbors, and was surrounded by enough fields and woods to guarantee I'd have no distraction. The pictures showed an old wooden porch, some chipped paint on the siding, and a narrow attic window. The real estate agent wasn't pushy. She just gave me the keys, told me to watch out for squirrels in the attic, and left. I arrived on a Monday afternoon with a few boxes in my truck. I didn't have a lot of furniture, just a mattress, a couple of chairs, a small dining table, and my clothes. The house smelled damp, like it had been left closed up for months. The kitchen had a single sink and an ancient refrigerator that rattled when I plugged it in. The living room was mostly empty except for a fireplace and some built-in shelves that had probably seen better days. I felt a sense of calm, though. The silence was comforting after years of traffic noise. On my first night, I unpacked a few essentials: bedding, some plates, and a lamp for the bedroom. The rest of the boxes stayed in the living room, and I planned to sort them out later. The quiet outside felt eerie, but I welcomed it. No horns, no sirens, just crickets, wind in the trees, and the occasional rustling of leaves. I was so tired from the move that I fell asleep without thinking about the attic or any of the other rooms. The next morning, I woke up early. I had no job to go to, no alarm to shut off. My back ached from sleeping on a half-inflated air mattress. I threw on some jeans, made black coffee, and decided to explore the house. The attic was at the top of a narrow staircase that folded down from the ceiling. When I climbed up, I noticed dust everywhere. My footsteps kicked up clouds that made me cough. The single window was covered with grime, letting in just enough light to see the outline of a few pieces of furniture. I saw a trunk, some chairs stacked in the corner, and a large grandfather clock leaning against the far wall. It was an odd sight because the clock seemed in decent condition compared to everything else, like someone had been taking care of it. The wooden frame had a carved pattern along the edges. The glass cover over the clock face was intact and the pendulum inside looked shiny. I stepped closer and saw that the clock wasn't wound up. There was no key in it. I tapped the wooden case, expecting it to sound hollow, but it made a solid thud. I shrugged and decided I'd check it out later. I spent the rest of the day sweeping the attic floor and moving some dusty boxes. I didn't think about the clock again until that night. I was downstairs reading a magazine around dusk when I heard a deep gong. It was so loud it made my ears buzz. My heart jumped because I didn't expect any loud noise in this quiet house. I followed the sound upstairs, and it was clear it came from the attic. I climbed up again, pushing aside cobwebs. The clock's pendulum was swinging back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. No one had wound it. There was no battery that I could see. But it was running and chiming like it knew exactly when the sun went down. As I stood there staring at it, something in my vision shifted. For a few seconds, the attic seemed to change shape. The walls around me became darker, and I saw flickers of light moving across them like faint silhouettes. My stomach twisted, and I got this sense that I was looking at something I shouldn't be seeing. When I blinked, it was gone. The clock's pendulum kept swinging, and the ticking echoed in the attic. My hands were shaking. I hurried downstairs, closed the hatch, and tried to convince myself I was just tired. I told myself it was some leftover stress from my old life. I tried to shake it off, but I was on edge the rest of the night. I heard the wind rattling the windows, and I jumped at every little creak in the house. My heart pounded so loud I couldn't focus on my book or the TV. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were broken. I woke up several times, sweaty and uneasy. Morning came slowly. The next day, I made a plan to ignore the attic and focus on fixing up the main rooms. I mopped the floors, wiped down the kitchen countertops, and cleaned out a thick layer of dust from the fireplace. In the afternoon, I drove into the nearest town. It was a small place with one main street. I stopped at a local store to pick up groceries and some basic supplies. The store owner was an older man with a raspy voice. He asked if I was new in the area, and I told him I'd just moved into the old house near the crossroads. He gave me a curious look, but he didn't say much. I paid and left, feeling a bit unsettled by the way he stared at me. I got home around sunset. The moment I walked in, I noticed how still the air felt. It was that hour when the light outside starts to fade, and everything gets this shadowy feel. I tried to keep my mind off the attic, but I found myself glancing toward the ceiling. My pulse was racing because I knew the clock was going to ring again. I turned on some music, but that made me more jumpy. So I turned it off and waited. The gong came at the exact moment the sun disappeared below the horizon. It was that same deep, echoing sound. It shook my chest. I felt my throat tighten. My feet started moving toward the attic steps, even though every part of me wanted to run. I felt like the clock was pulling me up there. When I opened the hatch, the chime died out and the pendulum was in full swing again. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingertips brushed the wooden case, everything shifted in my vision again. This time, I didn't see just flickers. I saw an entire scene laid over the real attic. The walls looked covered in glowing mold or fungus, giving off a faint greenish light. The air felt heavy, making it hard to breathe. I saw figures standing around in hoods, but I couldn't see their faces. They were tall and still like statues. My muscles tensed. I tried to speak or move, but I felt locked in place. My mouth went dry, and my breathing got shallow. I heard soft, distorted whispers, but I couldn't understand them. Then it was gone. Everything snapped back to normal. The dusty attic reappeared, and the clock's pendulum was just swinging quietly. My legs felt weak. I stumbled down the stairs and nearly fell. My mind was spinning. I had no idea what was happening. I sat on the living room couch trying to steady my breathing. My hands were sweaty, and my shirt was damp from sweat. I stared at the floor for a long time, trying to think of some logical explanation, but I came up blank. For the next few days, I avoided the attic completely. I focused on small tasks, organizing the kitchen, repairing a loose step on the porch, cleaning the bathroom. Every day I braced myself for sunset. Every time the clock chimed, I heard it clearly through the floorboards. Each gong made my heart pound, and I felt a cold wave roll through my spine. But I stayed downstairs, gripping the arms of my chair and waiting for it to stop. I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up to nightmares of those hooded figures or to the imagined ticking of that pendulum in my ears. Finally, I decided I couldn't live like that. I drove back into town and tried asking around about the house. Most people shrugged and said they didn't know much. The store owner suggested I talk to a local handyman who'd once done some work up there. The handyman was a solid guy in his 50s, with dirt under his fingernails and a baseball cap stained with sweat. I asked if he knew anything about a grandfather clock in the attic of my place. His eyes narrowed, and he got quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I never touched that thing. Don't think it's been moved in decades." I pressed him for more, but he just shook his head and told me he'd heard rumors about odd happenings, but nothing concrete. He seemed uneasy talking about it. I went to the local library next, a small brick building that smelled like old paper. I asked the librarian for historical records on my property. She handed me a folder of land deeds and some old newspaper clippings. There wasn't much. The house was built in the early 1900s and had passed through a few families. I saw no mention of a strange clock or anything supernatural. I left feeling frustrated, with no real leads. That night, the clock chimed again. I braced myself but stayed downstairs. My heart raced for a few minutes afterward, but I didn't see any visions. I wondered if the visions only happened if I was in the attic when it chimed. I told myself that maybe I'd be okay if I just avoided it. But the next evening, something unexpected happened. The gong sounded earlier, not exactly at sunset, but close. I was in the living room, flipping through an old magazine, when the sound hammered through the ceiling. My skin prickled, my body tensed, and then, without warning, the living room itself flickered. I saw flickers of the same glowing fungus on the walls, as if it was seeping through from the attic. My sofa disappeared for a few seconds, replaced by an old wooden bench covered in dust. I saw faint shapes in the corners, all hooded, just like before. My stomach churned, and I jumped up, feeling a surge of adrenaline. My vision blurred, and the room went back to normal. I stood there, my breath coming in short bursts. My hands were shaking, and I felt dizzy. I realized the visions were no longer confined to the attic. That terrified me. I felt trapped in my own house. I decided I needed help from someone who actually studied old objects or knew about antiques. The next day, I found the number of a local antique dealer who specialized in clocks. His name was Stuart. I called him and described the clock, leaving out the strange visions. I said I wanted to know its origin. He agreed to come by that afternoon. When he arrived, I led him into the attic. He examined the clock carefully, running his hands over the wood, checking the face, tapping the pendulum. His expression was serious. "This mechanism doesn't match the usual designs," he said. "There's no keyhole or place to wind it, which is odd for a clock of this style. It's almost like it was built to run without a traditional gear system." He pulled out a flashlight and peered inside. "There's something etched in the wood, but it's worn." He squinted. "Looks like initials or a symbol. I can't tell." He tried to move the pendulum, but it swung back immediately like it had a will of its own. The hair on my arms stood up when I saw that. Stuart frowned and stepped back. I could see he was uneasy. I decided to be direct and told him about the nightly chime and the fact it was happening without any winding or power source. I left out the visions, worried he might think I was crazy. He looked at me with confusion, then said he'd do some research and get back to me. That night, the chime came again at dusk. I took a deep breath and forced myself to go upstairs. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my temples. The attic was dimly lit by a single light bulb. The clock ticked loudly, and the pendulum was a blur, swinging faster than I'd ever seen. When the deep gong struck, the whole attic felt like it shook. The dust on the floor jumped, and I stumbled. My head pounded and my vision flashed. The scene layered over reality again. The fungus on the walls glowed brighter than before. The hooded figures were back, standing around the clock. I smelled something like damp soil and rotten wood. My nostrils flared and I almost gagged. I tried to move away, but my legs felt heavy. One of the figures turned toward me, and even though I couldn't see a face, I sensed it was looking at me. My heart pounded harder, and I felt sweat dripping down my back. Then, just as quickly, it ended. The attic was back to normal. I staggered and almost fell to my knees. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, arms wrapped around myself, trying to slow my breathing. I felt clammy and nauseous. I realized I was in over my head. I needed someone who could explain these visions, not just the clock's mechanics. The next day I tried calling a local historian, but he wasn't available for a couple of weeks. I tried contacting a friend from my old city life, but I'd pushed most people away when I decided to move. I was alone. Over the following nights, the chimes continued without fail. Each sunset brought a new echo. Sometimes the visions were short flashes in the living room or hallway. Other times they were longer episodes that trapped me in that other version of my house for what felt like minutes. I started to dread the afternoons because I knew sunset was coming. I kept all the lights on in the house, hoping it would make the illusions less intense, but it didn't help. I didn't want to leave because this place was supposed to be my escape from stress. But now it was worse than anything I'd experienced in the city. I finally decided to contact Stuart again. He answered on the second ring. I told him I had urgent questions. He agreed to come out the next morning. When he arrived, he looked more tired than before, like he'd been losing sleep too. He told me he'd found references to clocks built by a small group of craftsmen in the late 1800s who experimented with unusual designs. One article mentioned clocks that supposedly kept time based on certain lunar or solar alignments, not standard mechanical parts. I noticed he hesitated, like he didn't want to sound ridiculous. He said these craftsmen were rumored to be involved in strange rituals or beliefs. I felt a cold sweat forming on my neck. I asked him if there was any way to stop the clock. He suggested physically dismantling it, but I'd already tried to open the back and it wouldn't budge. The wood felt solid and the edges seemed sealed. I even tried prying it with a screwdriver earlier, but it didn't move. Stuart said he didn't want to try smashing it because it might damage the house or cause more problems. That night, I prepared myself. I dragged a heavy workbench up to the attic. I put on heavy gloves and goggles. When the chime began, I rushed up the stairs, determined to find some weak spot in the clock structure. I swung a hammer at the side of the case. The impact echoed, and the clock rattled, but it didn't break. My hands trembled, and I felt a deep vibration in my arms like hitting solid stone. The pendulum jerked wildly, and I lost my balance. I fell against a stack of old boxes, my hip slamming into the floor. Pain shot through my side, and I groaned. My flashlight slid across the attic and the bulb flickered. In that flicker, I saw the hooded figures again. They were close, almost within arm's reach. The glow of the fungus on the walls lit their outlines. I could smell that damp, foul odor again, and my heart hammered in my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and raced downstairs, ignoring the pain in my side. I slammed the attic door shut, my hands shaking, my forehead beaded with sweat. I heard the final chime echo in my ears, a deep, vibrating note. Now I'm in the living room, pacing back and forth. My hip throbs. My entire body feels on edge. I keep looking up at the ceiling, half expecting those figures to come right through the boards. The house is silent for the moment, but I know dusk will come again tomorrow, and the clock will chime. I don't know what these visions mean or why they've latched on to me, but I can't escape them anymore, and I'm afraid the next time might be worse. I have no idea if there's a way to break this cycle. All I know is that I can't ignore it anymore. The clock is there, ticking and waiting, and each chime pulls me deeper into something I can't explain. I still remember the moment I first saw that painting. It sat in a dimly lit gallery, propped against a wall near the back. The frame looked worn, and the canvas had a strange, uneven texture. It showed a gloomy forest with crooked trees packed so tightly together that I felt claustrophobic just looking at them. In the bottom corner, there was a man without a face. His shape was there. His body was there. But where there should have been eyes and a mouth, there was only a blank space. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't look away. I bought it because something about it felt important, like it was tied to me in a way I couldn't explain. I carried it home that same day. The ride was quiet. I put the painting in the trunk of my car, and I kept glancing over my shoulder at every stoplight. Even though the trunk was closed, I had this idea that I could hear something shifting back there. But I didn't see anything when I popped the trunk open in front of my house. It was just the painting, wrapped in a thin layer of plastic, leaning against the spare tire. I grabbed it under my arm, shut the trunk with my elbow, and walked inside. My house is small. The entrance leads straight into a cramped living room with a dark brown couch and a coffee table covered in old magazines. I had to move a lamp and a dusty vase off a shelf so I could hang the painting. Once I got it up, I stepped back to look at it. The forest in the painting looked even darker than I remembered from the gallery. I got close and ran my fingertips over the canvas. It felt rough, like old burlap. When I stood back again, I realized the faceless figure was angled in such a way that it seemed to stare at me even though it had no eyes. I felt a slight pressure in my chest, but I couldn't explain why. That evening, I tried to go about my normal routine. I made a simple dinner, ate in front of the TV, and then washed the dishes. Every time I passed through the living room, though, I glanced at the painting. I sometimes paused, just long enough to check if anything looked different. At that point, it seemed unchanged. The trees, the figure, the eerie darkness, it was all there, but nothing else stood out. Still, I felt uneasy. I took a long shower, then climbed into bed and tried to sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. because I heard a noise. It sounded like a faint whisper coming from somewhere in the house. My chest tightened, and I felt a rush of heat in my forehead. I got out of bed, slowly, and stood there in the dark, listening. The sound was low and constant, like a radio that's barely turned up. I tiptoed out to the hallway, then into the living room. That was when I realized the whispering was coming from the painting. I froze in place, heart hammering. I couldn't make out any clear words, but I could tell it wasn't just random noise. There was a rhythm to it, like a person trying to speak through clenched teeth. My entire body tensed up. I took a step closer. The whispering got sharper, like it recognized I was there. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight, and I just managed to croak out a single, "Hello?" That's when everything went silent. I stood in front of the painting for maybe a minute, breathing slowly, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I went back to bed, but I had trouble sleeping. My head buzzed with confusion, and my heart wouldn't calm down. The next morning, I walked into the living room and gave the painting a quick look. For a second, I thought the trees looked different. I couldn't be sure, so I brought my face closer and studied each trunk, each branch. It all looked the same as before, except it felt a little more crowded near the center. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just tired. I had breakfast, then left for work, but even at the office, I caught myself thinking about that whisper. It had seemed so real, so close, like someone was standing right behind me. I tried to write it off as a dream or maybe a trick of my own mind, but something about it stuck with me. That night, I decided to watch the painting more closely. I turned off all the lights, then sat on the couch in the dark. The television was off, my phone was on silent, and the only light came from a small street lamp outside that cast a faint glow through the window. I stared at the painting for a while, trying not to blink too much. At first, it was all quiet. Then, just when I began to think nothing was going to happen, I heard that faint whisper again. It was so soft I had to hold my breath to hear it clearly. It said something that sounded like, "Careful." The voice had a harsh edge, like someone forcing the word out with strain. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my ears. I wanted to jump up and turn on the lights, but I stayed where I was. I whispered back, "Who are you?" I'm not sure why I did that, but it felt like the right thing to do. There was a small pause, and then it whispered again, but I couldn't make out the words. I recognized the tone, though. It felt like a warning. I felt my skin crawl. That was the moment I noticed the man in the painting looked slightly different. His faceless head was no longer completely blank. There was a subtle hint of an outline, like faint shadows where eyes might be. I squinted and leaned forward. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't imagined it. His face was starting to take shape. I stood up and flicked on the lights, wanting to confirm what I'd seen. The painting looked the same as it had before, but I had this strong feeling that if I stared long enough, those faint features would reappear. I felt sweat collecting on my forehead, and I wiped it away with my sleeve. My hands trembled a bit. I reminded myself that it was just a painting, just an image on a canvas, but that didn't calm me down. I turned on the TV, let some random news program play, and tried to distract myself. Yet I kept glancing at the painting every time I heard even the slightest creak in the house. Finally, I decided to go to bed and hope I'd be able to sleep. The next few days were tense. Each night, I heard whispers. Sometimes they were just random words like beware, look, or stop. Other times I could almost make out full sentences. They sounded like warnings about things I didn't want to acknowledge. Stuff about my job, my past, and even small decisions I was making. One evening, the whisper said, "Don't leave the window open," right before I heard a strong gust of wind rattle the glass. When I ran over to check, I found the window had just started to slide open on its own. If I hadn't gone there in time, the wind might have knocked over a few fragile items on the windowsill. That was a simple example, but it made me think these whispers were trying to protect me. Still, I didn't trust them. My gut tightened every time I heard that voice. Something about it felt invasive. I started to avoid the living room except when absolutely necessary. I even considered taking the painting down, but each time the thought crossed my mind, I felt a sudden spike of fear, like removing it would bring something worse. At one point, I grabbed the painting off the wall with the intention of throwing it out. I took it as far as the front door. My hands shook, and my body felt cold all over. The painting itself felt heavy, heavier than it should have for its size. It felt like it was pushing down on my arms. I ended up carrying it back to the living room and hanging it again. Right after I did, I heard a whisper that said, "Good." I felt trapped. I didn't want to have that thing in my house anymore, but something about it compelled me to keep it. I tried to think of a reason. Maybe it was the strange warnings that seemed to help me avoid small accidents. Or maybe I was just too scared to see what would happen if I got rid of it. I caught myself pacing around the house, especially at night, checking the painting from different angles. The trees in the forest were definitely changing. Each evening, the branches looked more twisted, and the trunk seemed to close in around the faceless man, like a living cage. And that man's face became clearer each time I saw it. After about a week, I started to see real detail in the faceless figure's head. It looked vaguely like me. The hairline, the shape of the jaw, even the outline of the ears. It was all starting to resemble my own reflection. I stared at it for a good 10 minutes one night, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. I reached up to touch my own face, then turned and looked at the painting. The resemblance was impossible to deny. That's when the whisper came again. This time stronger and more direct. It said, "Don't ignore me, listen." I stepped back, my knees feeling weak. My mind raced. I wondered how the painting knew things about me. The next day I got home from work exhausted. I opened the front door, dropped my keys on the table, and froze. I heard a sudden hiss coming from the painting. It sounded like it was calling my name. My pulse quickened. I walked over, took a deep breath, and faced it. This time the whisper told me to check the phone. I frowned. My phone was in my pocket. I pulled it out. There was a message from my boss, asking me to come to the office an hour earlier the next morning because of an urgent meeting. I had missed the notification because my phone had been on silent. For a moment I felt grateful I got the message in time, but the idea that the painting knew about a phone call I hadn't checked yet made me break out in a cold sweat. From that night on, the whispers grew more frequent and more personal. They warned me about arguments with neighbors, told me when I forgot to lock the front door, and even reminded me to pay a bill I almost overlooked. Each time, the painting's figure looked more like me, and the forest closed in tighter around him. The tension in my chest never let up. I felt like something was squeezing the air out of my lungs every time I passed that painting. I didn't want to look at it, but I also couldn't resist it. Part of me felt weirdly dependent on its warnings. I started having nightmares. I dreamed that I was in that forest, running between the trees while something followed me. I couldn't see who or what it was, but I heard whispers that sounded exactly like the voice coming from the painting. I'd wake up covered in sweat, heart pounding, and I'd think about getting rid of the painting again. But each time, I felt an overwhelming dread. I worried that removing it would cut me off from these warnings that might be saving me from who knows what. I also worried that destroying it might unleash something worse. My mind played out all kinds of possibilities. Would I lose my mind? Would I start hearing whispers without the painting around? Then one night, I stood in front of the painting and said out loud, "What do you want?" My voice cracked at the end, and I felt my body trembling from my hands down to my knees. The whisper answered, "Stay safe." It repeated that phrase over and over for what felt like a full minute. My shoulders tensed and my palms got clammy. When it finally stopped, I felt my breath catch in my throat. I looked closer at the painting. The figure was now almost a perfect match for me. The face had the same lines around the eyes that I see in my bathroom mirror. The same slight crease in the forehead. The eyes themselves were blank though, like white orbs. I leaned in until my nose was only an inch away from the canvas. The texture felt coarse and uneven. I could smell the old paint and something else underneath, like damp wood. My stomach churned. A wave of nausea hit me. I staggered back and stared at the forest in the picture. The trees pressed around the figure so tightly, I could barely see any space between them. The leaves looked sharp like knives, and they wrapped around the figure's arms. My arms. I could almost feel a pressure around my own wrists. I flexed my fingers. They tingled in a strange way, like pins and needles. The voice whispered again, telling me something about secrets. It said, "Don't hide." And then it went silent. I had no idea what that meant. I tried to speak back, but nothing came out. My throat felt raw. Over the next 2 days, I felt a constant anxiety that pressed down on me like a weight. I couldn't focus at work, and I avoided going home until late. When I finally got back each night, I'd walk straight to the painting, half expecting it to greet me. The whispers still came, usually in the middle of the night, telling me small things about my life or random instructions. One time, it told me to check the stove. I found that the burner knob was slightly turned on even though I hadn't touched it. Another time, it warned me about a leak under the bathroom sink, and sure enough, I found a small puddle forming there. All these warnings felt helpful, but I couldn't shake the sense that something darker was unfolding. The painting kept changing, and I noticed new details each time. I saw a faint silhouette of a second figure lurking among the trees, but I couldn't make out its shape completely. The voice never mentioned that figure, and I wasn't sure if it was important. Still, every time I looked, I saw it move a little closer. I decided one evening I couldn't live like this anymore. The constant fear, the sleepless nights, the creeping sense that the painting was taking over my life. It was too much. I placed a hand on the frame, felt that rough texture against my skin, and I said, "I'm done." Then I lifted it off the wall. It felt heavy again, like something inside it was resisting me. My arms quivered and I nearly dropped it. I told myself that I would store it in the garage until I figured out how to get rid of it for good. Maybe I'd burn it or bury it somewhere. I just needed it out of my living room. As I carried it toward the garage door, I heard a loud whisper that sounded more like a shout. "Stop!" My ears rang, and I felt an instant wave of dizziness. My grip loosened, and I almost let the painting slip from my hands. I forced myself forward step by step, sweat dripping down my face. My heart thundered in my chest. My arms shook so much I thought they might give out. When I got to the garage, I set the painting against the wall, face inward so I couldn't see it. My breathing was heavy and my shirt was drenched. For a moment I stood there, shoulders slumped, trying to catch my breath. My hands felt numb, and my knees wobbled. I waited for more whispers, but all I heard was my own heartbeat. I stepped away from the painting, reached for the door, and left it there in the dark. Back inside, I locked the garage door. My chest felt tight. I waited, listening for any hint of that voice. I heard nothing. No strange whispers, no warnings, no pleas. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I sat down on my couch and realized I hadn't felt that kind of silence in days. My ears rang with the echo of my own pulse. Now I'm stuck with this choice. If I leave the painting in the garage, I have no idea what will happen next. Maybe it'll stay silent. Maybe the whispers will come back. Part of me worries that something worse will happen if I try to destroy it. Another part of me thinks I need to stand my ground, break it apart, and move on. I haven't decided yet. I'm sitting here, feeling my heart hammer in my chest, wondering if I'll sleep tonight or if I'll hear that voice again through the walls. I keep telling myself that I'll be okay, but I can't shake the feeling that the painting's warnings will stay with me. And I can't ignore the fact that its face looked like mine. It's in my head now, and I don't know if I'll ever really be free. I noticed the smell of old wood and stale air the second I pushed open the front door. I remember pausing on the threshold, wondering if I should turn around and leave. The lobby lights were weak, and there was a faint flicker in one of the bulbs overhead. The place felt deserted, even though the front desk clerk was sitting right there staring at me. I checked in anyway because I had driven so far into the mountains that it seemed pointless to back out. The room was cheap and the location was supposed to be quiet. I didn't mind isolation at first, I just needed a break from everything. I'm going to tell you what happened during my stay. I don't have a creative way to wrap this up. I'm just telling it straight because I still feel uneasy thinking about it. I've told parts of this story to a couple of close friends, and they looked at me like I was making it up. I'm not. I'll describe exactly what I saw and did. I won't guess about the rest. The hotel was a small lodge high in the mountains, far from any major road. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty. My car was the only one there. It felt strange to be the only guest, but the clerk didn't seem surprised. He handed me a simple key with a plastic fob and pointed down the hallway. I noticed the reception area was cramped and smelled like old paper. There were a few dusty brochures about local hiking trails on a small table. I picked one up, but the pictures looked faded. I put it back. My room was on the second floor. The hallway was lit by one overhead fixture that hummed. I heard the faint buzz as I walked. The carpet looked worn. When I got to my room, I unlocked the door and stepped in. The walls were covered in a light pattern that might have been white once, but had turned a grayish color. The bed was an old queen size with a thin blanket and 2 flat pillows. There was a small bathroom to the side with a stained mirror, a toilet, and a cramped shower. I dropped my suitcase on the bed and opened the window. I felt the cool mountain air on my face, which was a relief because the room smelled a little musty. That first night, nothing major happened. I tried to watch some TV, but the channels were fuzzy. I turned it off and decided to take a walk in the hallway. I'm not usually curious about old hotels, but I was restless. I walked to the far end of the corridor, past a couple of closed doors. The lights got dimmer near the end where I saw another small staircase going up. I stepped onto the first stair and heard a creak. It felt like I wasn't supposed to go up there, but I did anyway. The upper floor was darker. I saw a single window at the far end. The hallway smelled like it hadn't been opened in years. I took a few steps, then noticed a door that was slightly open. It wasn't labeled with a number like the other rooms. I felt a little uneasy, but I nudged it open and peeked inside. The room was dark, but I could see a shape that looked like an old chair. I also smelled something strong, like mold or mildew. I reached for the light switch on the wall, but it didn't work. My eyes started to adjust. And that's when I saw a small table with a book on it. The book was covered in dust. I leaned in and saw that it was a diary with a worn leather cover. I remember feeling my heart rate pick up. I don't know why. Maybe it was the silence. It felt too quiet up there. I noticed my breathing was loud, and my hands felt clammy. I opened the diary. The first page had a name scrawled in shaky handwriting. It said, "The Hermit," except it was in Portuguese as "O Eremita," which confused me because everything else in the room was in English. The next few pages described the writer's daily routine. He talked about living in isolation, practicing certain rituals to cross into other dimensions, and contacting beings made of shadow. My first thought was that this was some old story or a hoax left behind by a guest, but it didn't feel like a normal diary. Some of the entries were extremely detailed about steps to pierce the veil. As it said in one part, I felt a cold draft run across my arms. It made me shiver. I closed the diary and took a slow breath. My heart was pounding, but I didn't see a reason to stay. I left the diary on the table and walked out of the room. The hallway felt darker than before, and I could barely see the stairs. When I got back to my room, my mouth was dry. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking I heard something in the hallway, like soft footsteps, but whenever I got up to check, I saw nothing. The next morning, I went downstairs to see if the clerk was around. The desk was empty. I looked for a bell or something to ring, but didn't see one. I tapped on the desk and called out, but no one answered. I saw a small door behind the desk, probably leading to a back office. I didn't feel comfortable snooping, so I just waited a minute. When no one came out, I headed back upstairs. The whole place felt abandoned. I thought about leaving, but I had a weird sense of curiosity about that diary and the mention of strange practices. I'm not into supernatural stuff, but there was something about the emptiness of the hotel and the isolation of the mountains that made me want to see more. I decided to go back to that upstairs room. I walked up the same steps, expecting the same smell of mildew. This time the smell wasn't as strong. The door was still slightly open. I stepped in, and I noticed that the dust in the air looked less thick. The old chair seemed cleaner. The floor had fewer scuff marks. I didn't understand. It looked like someone had cleaned up during the night. The diary was still there. I picked it up again and opened it to a random page. The writer described a process where he placed mirrors around the room, in corners and along the walls. He mentioned lighting some kind of incense. He wrote about chanting certain words to invite shadows to move through a thin spot between realities. I felt uneasy reading that. I flipped a few pages and found an entry that said, "The next guest here will finish my work. I've set the stage. They will feel the presence." I heard a small noise out in the hallway. I froze. It sounded like a soft shuffle or a brushing sound. I listened for a few seconds, but it stopped. My pulse was racing. I closed the diary and placed it on the table. My head was pounding, and I felt sweat on my forehead. I decided to go downstairs and check the lobby again. I hurried down the steps, feeling like I was being watched the whole time. There was no one around. I stepped outside onto the front porch of the hotel to get some fresh air. The mountains were quiet. The sky was gray, and a little rain was falling. The wind was cold. I stayed there for a while, just trying to calm down. That night I heard noises in the hallway again. They were louder this time. I could have sworn I heard something like a door opening and closing. I stepped into the corridor and looked around. The lights flickered. I didn't see anyone. My hands were shaking and I felt a tightness in my chest. I tried to reassure myself that old buildings make noises, but it felt too deliberate. I locked my door and turned out the lights. I stayed awake for hours, my eyes on the crack of light under the door. At one point, I noticed a shadow pass by. I held my breath. It didn't stop and I didn't hear footsteps, but it definitely blocked the light for a second or two. I barely slept. The following morning, I told myself I would pack and leave. But when I started to put my clothes in my suitcase, I felt a pull to go check the hidden room again. It made no sense, but I couldn't ignore the urge. I walked back upstairs, and I found the door wide open. The smell of mildew was almost gone. The chair looked different. It was positioned near the window. There was a mirror on the wall that I hadn't noticed before. It looked old, with a simple wooden frame. The glass had small spots of discoloration on it. The diary was on the table, open to a page describing how to welcome the watchers. It said to place a mirror directly in front of the door and recite something in a whisper. I didn't read the whole thing. I shut the diary. My skin crawled at the idea of continuing someone's weird ritual. I walked around the room looking at the mirror. My reflection was a little distorted. I heard a faint sound from the hallway, like a floorboard creaking. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned around quickly, but no one was there. I walked to the door and peered into the hallway. Empty. I turned back to the mirror and saw something behind me in the reflection. It looked like a dark shape, but it disappeared in less than a second. I spun around and there was nothing. I felt dizzy. I grabbed the diary and walked out. I headed straight to my room, locked the door, and threw the diary onto the bed. I paced around, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to burn the diary or toss it outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was some kind of puzzle. I flipped through the pages, scanning them for any mention of normal events. But everything was about crossing dimensions, contacting shadow beings, or opening doorways. Toward the back, I saw a final entry. To the next guest, your curiosity brought you here. Finish what I started. The Watchers want a vessel. I slammed the diary shut. I was sweating, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't like the word vessel. I shoved the diary under the pillow and tried to collect my thoughts. My body was tense. My fists were clenched and my teeth were grinding. I decided to leave right then. I didn't care about the money I'd spent. I shoved everything into my bag in a rush. As I stepped into the hallway, the lights were off. The overhead fixture that usually flickered was dead. I could barely see. I used the flashlight on my phone. I reached the staircase, and I heard a door upstairs slam shut. It was loud. My chest tightened. I felt a jolt of fear surge through me. My hands shook, and my mind raced with thoughts of some stranger lurking up there. I forced myself down the stairs and walked to the lobby. The desk was empty again. I looked around for the clerk, but I saw no one. I walked out the front door, half expecting it to be stuck, but it opened without resistance. Outside, the rain had stopped, but it was still overcast. I hurried to my car. The engine turned over on the first try. I glanced at the hotel lobby windows and thought I saw movement, but I couldn't be sure. I drove away, feeling the tension in my neck and shoulders. My hands gripped the wheel too hard. I took a few deep breaths. My heart was racing, and I felt like I needed to get as far as possible from that building. But a strange thought occurred to me about 10 minutes down the road. I realized I had the diary. I'd left it under the pillow, but in my rush, I'd stuffed it into my bag without thinking. I felt the weight of it there, pressed up against the side of my laptop. I pulled over on the side of the mountain road. My mind was spinning. I considered throwing the diary onto the rocks. Part of me was terrified of what might happen if I kept it, but I also couldn't bring myself to toss it away. I felt this weird responsibility, like I'd become part of a chain of events I didn't understand. I opened my bag and pulled it out. The leather cover was worn, and the title O Eremita looked faint. I noticed that some of the dust from the room was still on it. I flipped to a random page and I saw the instructions for the mirror ritual again. My stomach churned. My breathing was shallow and my palms were sweaty. I stared at the words for a moment, then closed the diary. My mind kept going back to that shape I saw in the mirror, that dark blur behind me. I looked around through my car windows, half expecting to see some shape outside. The road was empty in both directions. The trees rustled softly in the breeze. I decided to keep driving. I felt like the diary needed to be somewhere else. I still don't know why I felt that way. Maybe I just wanted to get it away from the hotel. I arrived at a small diner about 30 miles away. I went inside and ordered a coffee. I sat there, sipping and trying to calm my nerves. My hands were still shaking a bit. I realized I was on edge, listening to every sound. The quiet hum of the diner's neon sign felt safer than the silence of the hotel halls. I told myself that maybe it was all some elaborate trick or the diary was just a creepy story left behind by a past guest. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. After finishing my coffee, I looked at the diary again. My heart pounded just holding it. I could almost feel something staring at me from within the pages. At that moment, I made a decision. I would store it somewhere and never read it again. I drove until I found a small post office in a nearby town. I bought a padded envelope and placed the diary inside it. I wrote my own address on it without a return address. I mailed it to myself because part of me didn't want it with me, but I also couldn't leave it behind. I figured it would buy me time to decide what to do next. When I got home days later, the diary was waiting in my mailbox. I felt a rush of anxiety picking it up. I brought it inside, and I put it in a shoebox in my closet. I told myself I'd never open it again. Sometimes at night I get a sense that something is watching me. I check the mirrors in my apartment and see nothing unusual. I remind myself that I'm imagining things, but I don't sleep well. I still feel like the watchers from that diary are out there, looking for a way in. I haven't gone back to that hotel. I don't plan to. I don't even know if it's still in operation. I never heard from the clerk. I never got a refund or a follow-up call. Sometimes I think about driving back up there just to see if it's still standing, but I don't want to. That place disturbed me. I can still smell that damp hallway whenever I think about it. I picture the hidden room with the diary on the table and the mirror on the wall. I remember the shape in the reflection. The memory makes my heart pound. I don't have a neat ending for this story. That's all there is. I left the hotel with the diary, and now it's in my closet. Some nights I stand in front of the closet door wondering if I should burn it, but I never do. I think part of me worries that getting rid of it would just make it worse. Maybe I'm paranoid. For now, it's hidden away, and that's where it'll stay. I'm sharing this because I need to let someone know what happened. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I just don't want to carry it alone. I felt something strange the moment I saw that fog on the horizon. It was late in the afternoon and I was alone on a nearly deserted road. I had been driving for hours and my eyes were tired from the endless gray blur. The sky looked smudged, like someone had smeared ash across the clouds. My plan was to push on until I reached a small town with a motel. But that fog came out of nowhere. It swallowed the road, made me squint and slow down. I tried turning on my high beams, but it was no use. The light just bounced back at me and I felt trapped in a white void. I pulled over to the side, thinking it would be safer than risking a collision. Then the world around me got quiet, as though all sound decided to hide. And that silence freaked me out. I turned off the engine and sat there, gripping the steering wheel. My hands felt clammy. My heart pounded in my chest, and I noticed my breathing getting shallow. The radio static was the only noise in the car, so I turned it off too. When I opened the door, I noticed the air was cool and damp. I took a step onto the gravel shoulder and slammed the car door behind me. My headlights cut through some of the fog, but it was like shining a flashlight into a cloud. I saw swirling shapes in the haze like silhouettes dissolving. I shook my head and tried to focus. The first thing I did was check my phone. No signal. Typical. I glanced at the fuel gauge before leaving the car. I had a bit less than half a tank, so I wasn't desperate yet, but I didn't want to keep the engine running, wasting fuel, if I couldn't see more than a couple of feet in front of me. I stood there, staring at the fog drifting across the asphalt. The edges of the road vanished in the murk. My pulse beat heavier in my ears. I could feel the dampness on my skin. It clung to my face and arms. There was a slight chill, and I wished I had kept a jacket in the front seat. But all I had was a flannel shirt. I threw it on and zipped up the collar as best I could. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw a shape move. I spun around and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing, just swirling white. I told myself I was just tired. I had been driving all day and my brain was playing tricks. Then I heard something. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was a voice, quiet. My name stretched out in the distance. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I held my breath and listened. There it was again. From another direction, the same whispered call. It came from my left, then my right, then behind me. That's when I realized my only option was to stay calm. I walked back to the car and grabbed my flashlight. I kept shining it around. Fog swallowed the beam every time. I heard my name once more, and my mouth went dry. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded too loud in that silence. No one answered, just a soft echo of my own words. My heart thundered in my chest, and I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. The air carried a faint smell of moss and wet wood, like old logs after a rainfall. I heard a crunch of leaves off to the side, and I turned my flashlight toward the trees. At first, I couldn't see past the wall of fog, but then a shape drifted between the trunks. It was a vague outline, tall but not very distinct. It moved slow, almost gliding. I asked if it needed help, but it didn't respond. Instead, it drifted farther among the trees, and for some reason, I felt a pull to follow it. I glanced behind me at my car. The road was invisible under the thick mist. I tried to reason with myself. Wandering into the woods with limited visibility seemed like a bad idea, but part of me felt compelled. I didn't want to just stand by my car hearing my name whispered. I wanted answers. So I went after that figure, pointing my flashlight ahead and stepping carefully over roots and broken branches. As I moved deeper, I noticed more shapes. They seemed to appear in my peripheral vision and then vanish when I turned to look directly at them. Each time, my heart thumped hard. My breath caught in my throat and my legs felt tense. But I kept going. The air got colder under the trees. My ears picked up a soft drip of water hitting leaves. The ground felt spongy beneath my shoes. I noticed patches of old stone walls hidden behind thick vines. When I aimed my flashlight at them, I saw that they were covered in moss, and the stones looked cracked and ancient. Then a flash of movement caught my eye on the left side. I turned quickly and saw a figure slip behind a half-collapsed archway. My footsteps echoed on the damp ground as I approached that structure. My heart pounded faster the closer I got to the archway. It seemed to be part of a larger settlement. The remains of small buildings formed a circle around a central courtyard. Doors hung from rusty hinges. Windows had no glass, just empty frames. Green moss clung to every surface, and the wood was black with rot. The air felt heavier, and I caught a slight metallic taste in my mouth. I breathed through my nose, trying to stay calm. The fog here was dense, but it felt different. Instead of drifting randomly, it seemed to gather in the corners of the settlement, shaping itself into figures that hovered in the dark. Some of those shapes seemed almost human, but I couldn't make out any faces. I stepped into what looked like an old meeting hall or perhaps a main building. The roof had caved in. Pieces of wood lay strewn across the floor, and broken furniture was scattered around. I saw a row of chairs, all warped from the moisture. My flashlight shone on a big table with papers crumbled on top. I approached them and saw faint writing, but the ink was blurred and unreadable. The pages felt damp and fragile when I touched them. I couldn't get anything useful from them, so I placed them back where I found them. I suddenly heard a voice, a ragged whisper, calling my name again. It sounded close this time. My heart lurched. I spun around, shining my flashlight all around the remains of the hall. The beams caught another figure standing near a corner. It looked almost solid, but then it wavered and melted back into the fog. I walked over to the corner and found nothing but wet moss. My stomach was in knots. Sweat dripped down my forehead, and I wiped it with my sleeve. My breathing was fast, and my throat felt tight. I left the hall and moved back into the courtyard. I saw outlines of more buildings on the right. They looked like small houses, each with a broken door or a missing window. I noticed that the stones were arranged in a pattern on the ground, almost like a walkway. The fog covered most of it, but as I walked, I felt the uneven texture under my shoes. My flashlight revealed a cluster of footprints all facing different directions. Some were faint, as if left by people who had walked through this place long ago, but a few looked fresh, or at least not as worn down. That discovery made me tense up because I realized I might not be the only person wandering around. I wondered if other travelers had ended up here. Maybe the shapes I saw were them. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt unsettled. The voices whispering my name didn't seem like normal people calling out for help. I approached one of the houses, or what was left of it, and stepped inside. The roof beams were still intact in some spots, so there was a bit of shelter. I shined my light around and saw a small table with a cracked pitcher on it. I reached out and touched it. It was cold, slimy with growth. In the corner stood what looked like a wooden trunk, half rotten. I tried opening it, but the hinges were rusted shut. My hand slipped on the wet surface. I gave it a final tug, and the lid popped open with a crack. Inside, I found a couple of tattered blankets and a leather-bound notebook. The notebook's cover was green with mold, but I still flipped through a few pages. The writing inside was mostly smeared ink, with some dates and random notes. I couldn't read the full entries, but I saw references to people passing through, mentions of a thick fog and words like trapped and impossible to leave. I felt my chest tighten. I shoved the notebook back into the trunk. My mind raced. I couldn't ignore the possibility that I was stuck in the same situation as whoever wrote that. Yet I still held on to the hope that the road would clear. Maybe the fog would lift, and I could just drive away. I told myself I'd go back to my car soon, but I kept looking around, feeling compelled to learn more about this settlement. I stepped outside again, and the fog seemed thicker. My flashlight made a small circle of light, and beyond that, everything was just swirling white and gray. I heard something scrape against stone. It sounded like a footstep. I whipped my flashlight toward the noise and thought I saw a figure moving behind a nearby wall. My heart pounded, and my hands felt sweaty around the flashlight handle. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just another quiet whisper of my name, almost too soft to hear. The silence that followed was suffocating. I moved toward the wall and found a passage leading behind the houses. It opened onto a narrow path that disappeared into the tree line. The shapes in the fog seemed to drift along the edges of my vision, guiding me. My stomach churned, and I considered turning back, but I kept moving forward, step by step, arms tense at my sides. As I walked, I heard faint echoes of footsteps on wet ground behind me. I spun around, shining the light, but saw only the swirling mist. My breathing got heavier, and my legs started to feel weak. That path led me to another part of the settlement, where a cluster of stone buildings stood in a semicircle. Their roofs were mostly gone, leaving jagged frames. The place felt like it had been deserted for a very long time. I climbed a few steps to what might have been a large communal space. Inside, I found a stone fireplace caked in moss and lumps of charcoal on the floor. A few broken chairs lay off to the side, and old rope dangled from a hook in the ceiling. I walked around, searching for any sign of recent activity, but everything looked ancient. The fog pressed in from the open roof, swirling down in a slow spiral that made me dizzy. I felt that sense of being watched, like 1,000 unseen eyes were following my movements. My name was whispered again. This time it sounded closer. I tensed up and gripped my flashlight as though it was the only thing keeping me grounded. I said, "Show yourself," but it came out shaky. Then I heard a shuffling sound near the far corner of the space. I shone my light there and I froze. The fog gathered in that corner, forming a tall, vague silhouette. It almost had shoulders, a neck, and a head shape, but no details. I couldn't see any eyes or features. It lifted what looked like an arm and motioned for me to come closer. My heart hammered, and I felt sweat dripping down my back. My instincts told me to run, but I didn't. I took one slow step toward it. The figure receded, melting into the wall. I moved quickly to the spot, shining my flashlight all around. Nothing, just damp stones. I realized my breathing was ragged, and I felt an ache in my legs from all the tension. I needed to get back to my car. My mind pounded with the thought that the longer I stayed here, the harder it might be to leave. I hurried back through the building, found the path, and retraced my steps, hoping it would lead me back to the courtyard and then out to the trees where I first came in. The fog was thick, but I recognized the moss-covered walls. I followed them, ignoring the whispering voices. My own name was repeated in low, drawn-out tones that made me shiver. I kept pushing forward, heart pounding, sweat trickling down my temples. I finally reached the courtyard. I saw that old meeting hall to my left. Straight ahead should have been the trail leading back to the road. I forced myself to walk fast, scanning for anything that looked familiar. The trunk of a huge oak came into view, the same oak I had passed earlier. My shoes crunched over dead twigs. The air felt even colder now. My flashlight beam wobbled in front of me because my hands were shaking. I tried to steady my grip by pressing the flashlight against my chest with one hand and focusing on the ground. When I spotted the edge of the road, my chest almost burst from relief. I quickened my pace. The car came into view, half wrapped in fog. My shoulders sagged. I felt a wave of relief. I jogged the remaining distance, yanked the door handle, and got inside, slamming the door behind me. I locked it, even though I wasn't sure that would help. My breathing sounded loud in the enclosed space. I checked the ignition and the car started right up. That gave me a little spark of hope. The fog still covered everything, but I tried inching forward on the road. My headlights were useless. I crawled for a few yards, straining my eyes. Then I heard a low rumble, felt a slight shift in the wind, and noticed the fog thinning in front of me. I kept my foot light on the gas and moved ahead. The dense cloud receded enough that I could see a few feet more. I pushed the accelerator slightly, hoping to find better visibility around the next curve or the next mile. As I drove away, my throat still felt tight, and my skin was covered in sweat. I wasn't sure if I'd truly escaped that place or if I was just driving into another layer of fog. But at least I was moving. My headlights caught glimpses of the road lines, and I focused on them, trying not to look anywhere else. I didn't want to see any more shapes in the mist, I just wanted to get out. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heartbeat gradually settled into a strong, steady rhythm, but my mind kept replaying the whispering voices and those hazy outlines that seemed to watch me. I finally spotted a faded sign for the next town. That was the first real sign I had seen in what felt like hours. The road was still surrounded by fog, but it was clearing enough for me to make out the silhouettes of distant buildings. My phone chirped, signaling a weak signal. That sound almost made me laugh from relief. I didn't know what had happened back in that settlement. I didn't know if those voices were from living people or from something else. All I knew was that I made it out. My hands still felt shaky, my legs were sore, and my eyes stung from staring into swirling haze. But I kept driving, refusing to slow down until I finally reached a few scattered streetlights. Seeing that pale orange glow felt like stepping back into reality. When I pulled into the nearest open gas station, I stopped the car and sat there for a moment. My body trembled, my pulse raced, my mouth was dry and my head throbbed. But I was back on a road that led somewhere. I was around people again, even if they were just a few folks pumping gas and a bored attendant behind the counter. I wondered if anyone would believe me if I told them about that strange settlement and the shapes in the fog. Probably not. So I just took a deep breath, got out of the car, and stretched my legs. The night air felt a little warmer there, less heavy. I went inside, grabbed some water, and headed back to the car. I drove off thinking about the old buildings and the notebook I found. The word trapped stuck in my mind. Part of me couldn't stop worrying about those who came before me and never left. But I didn't see any direct evidence of what happened to them. I just knew I got out, and that was all that mattered right then. I kept going, keeping my eyes peeled for any signs of that fog following me. It didn't, at least not that I could see. Maybe it was gone. Or maybe it was still lurking somewhere waiting for the next traveler. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just wanted to keep driving until the night gave way to morning, and the road stretched out in clear, open air. I didn't think much about weird stuff when I first moved into my new loft. It was modern, had huge windows, and the open floor plan felt exciting. I expected to deal with noisy neighbors or random plumbing issues maybe, but I never thought I'd be wrestling with a bizarre symbol that kept showing up on my bedroom wall. I unpacked everything on a Saturday afternoon. By Sunday morning, I noticed a faint mark on the wall by my bed. It looked like someone had scratched a strange pattern into the paint. It was about the size of my hand, curved lines crossing at sharp angles. I thought it was some leftover graffiti from the previous tenant. I shrugged it off and decided I'd repaint. I grabbed some sandpaper, smoothed out the area, and covered it with a fresh coat. The next day, the lines were back. This time they looked bolder, like someone had traced over them during the night. I didn't hear anything during my sleep. I live alone, and the only entrance is my front door, which I keep locked. I tried ignoring it, but it felt impossible. It wasn't just a stain, it looked deliberate. I bought a thicker primer and painted again. I went to bed feeling confident. I woke up at 6 in the morning and checked the wall. The symbol was back, even sharper than before. It seemed to have deeper grooves like it had been carved. That's when I started getting that uncomfortable tingling in my gut. It felt wrong. I tried scraping it off. The paint flaked away, but the lines stayed. I got an uneasy rush of adrenaline. I tried to calm down, telling myself it might be some chemical reaction, or maybe the wall had moisture damage and shapes were forming. But it didn't look like mildew or random cracks. It looked designed. On Tuesday night, I took a photo of it. I zoomed in and studied every line. It almost looked like overlapping circles and triangles. I searched online for strange symbols scratched on wall, but I got a lot of nonsense results. Random occult forums, ghost stories, and joke websites. I kept scrolling until I found a post about ritual markings. A user had posted an image that looked similar to what I had. They called it a reality pierce mark. It was supposedly used in some obscure ritual to invite forces that could alter perception. It sounded ridiculous, but the resemblance was too close to ignore. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My hands shook a bit, but I still tried to be rational. The internet is full of nonsense, I thought, yet the symbol matched too well. That same night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange flickering in my room. At first I thought my eyes were adjusting to the dark. Then I noticed my bedside lamp was switching on and off in a quick pattern. The switch was next to me, and it wasn't moving physically. The lamp just kept flickering by itself. I sat up, reached out, and turned the lamp off entirely. It stopped flickering, but the ceiling light in the main area of the loft started doing the same thing, in sync with my breathing. I held my breath and it paused. I exhaled and the light blinked again. A jolt of panic shot through me. My hands felt clammy. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on, trying to see if maybe there was a weird electrical short. But as soon as the phone's flashlight came on, everything went dark and stayed dark. I got up, flipped the main switch on the wall. The lights came back normally. No more flicker. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I approached the bedroom wall like it was some kind of dangerous animal. The symbol was still there. It almost seemed to glow in the morning light, like a dull shine on the edges of the grooves. I ran my fingers over it. It felt smooth, with no difference in the texture of the wall, but it looked so defined, like it had been etched by a precise instrument. I decided I had to do something more. I tried using spackle to fill it in. I waited for it to dry, then sanded it carefully. I added a new coat of primer and let it set. In the evening, I put on a layer of the standard paint color. I waited an extra hour, then checked. It looked clean. I breathed out in relief, thinking I had finally fixed it. I turned in early, wanting to get some decent rest. Around midnight, a scraping sound woke me up. It came from the wall. It sounded like someone dragging a nail across the surface. My chest felt tight. I got up, turned on the lights, and saw the paint on the wall shifting like a swirl of wet paint. Then the lines started to form right in front of me. There was no hand, no tool. I just watched the shapes reappear on the wall, the same exact pattern, but now it had an extra curve at one side. My stomach flipped, and I felt bile rising in my throat. I backed away, knocked over a stack of books on the floor, and left the room. I flicked the hallway light on, took deep breaths, and splashed water on my face in the bathroom. My skin felt cold, and my hair was standing up on my arms and neck. I jumped onto my laptop and searched for the symbol again. I dug into more niche sites. Some people mentioned that this mark was known to cause dimensional interference or reality distortions. The words sounded absurd, but I didn't have a better explanation. It all said that once the mark appeared in a place, it acted like a beacon or anchor for certain entities. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons, but seeing that paint swirl on its own took me out of my comfort zone. The next few days, more strange things happened. Doors that I knew I had locked clicked open on their own, but when I tried to open them, they were stuck. Once I walked into the bathroom and heard a voice whisper my name behind the shower curtain. I stood in front of those tall iron doors with my flashlight trembling against the old bronze handles. I could feel the damp air on my face, and my hand felt cold as I tried to push the door open. It didn't budge. I stared at the faded sign above the doorway, which said Restricted Archives in chipped gold letters. I remember the sound of my own breathing. It echoed in that deserted corridor. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mouth felt dry. I had heard rumors about this section of the library, about strange books and old reports of unexplained events. I wanted inspiration for my writing, but part of me wondered if I was making a mistake by coming here so late at night. I arrived at the university earlier that day with a research permit for its normal collections. I told the librarian I was working on a historical piece about the region's academic heritage. That was partly true, but I also wanted to see if the stories about the hidden section were real. By the time I found these old doors, the regular library hours were over. The main lights in the corridors were off, but emergency lights created long shadows on the stone walls. I didn't see security guards, just the occasional sign reminding students to keep quiet. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulder, full of notepads and a few supplies. When I realized the doors were locked, I almost turned around. Then I saw the heavy chains around the handles. They were dusty with rust flaking off. Something about the chain looked old enough that maybe it had weakened over the years. I set my flashlight on the floor, pointed at the locks, and tried pulling the chain. It didn't break right away, so I started scanning the area for any cracks in the stone around the frame. A few minutes later, I spotted a loose section of wall near the bottom hinge. The mortar had crumbled. I wedged my shoulder against that part, feeling the cold stone press into my upper arm. The small gap grew wider when I pushed. My heart raced. After another shove, there was enough space for me to slip through sideways. Inside, the air smelled stale, like old paper and damp wood. I felt a slight draft, maybe from a vent or an unseen hallway. I swung my flashlight around the room. I saw shelves that were higher than I could reach, loaded with books that had thick layers of dust. There were cobwebs in the corners. I heard my own footsteps echo on the marble floor. The entire place felt abandoned, like nobody had been in there for years. Yet the presence of fresh footprints on the dust near the entrance told me somebody else had been there before me, though I had no idea when. I walked down one row of shelves and ran my finger along the spines of the books. Most had titles in languages I couldn't read. Others had no visible title at all. Some were just thick, brownish tomes with blank covers. My flashlight lit up the dust particles floating around me. The stillness made my skin crawl. I forced myself to keep moving. I wasn't here just to stand around. I wanted to see if the rumors about supernatural records were real. After a short search, I found a smaller room inside the main area, hidden by a partition. Inside, I noticed a large wooden table piled with old documents. The table was scarred with scratches. A single reading lamp stood in the center, connected to a frayed cord that snaked across the floor. I touched the lamp's switch. It clicked, but no light came on. I felt around the base and discovered there was no bulb. My flashlight would have to do. I set my bag on a chair and flipped open my notebook. My flashlight beam flickered against the edges of the books on the table. I saw a title that caught my attention: Manifestations in Rural Monasteries. Its spine was cracked and faded. I opened it. The musty smell made me cough. The first pages described encounters with unseen forces in old religious communities. There were accounts of people hearing voices in empty halls and feeling cold hands on their shoulders. Some passages were underlined in pencil. As I read, I made some notes. I wrote down a few key words, including invisible presence and whispering in darkness. While scribbling, I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck, like someone was standing right behind me. My whole body went tense. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I glanced over my shoulder. Nobody was there. My flashlight only showed an empty corner of the room. I took a step toward that corner, shining my light around. Nothing moved. I forced myself to return to the table. I kept reading. My eyes felt strained because the flashlight didn't offer much illumination. After a few more pages, I heard something faint near my right ear. It was a soft sound, like someone breathing out a few words. I swung my flashlight around, expecting to see someone. The room was empty. My heart started pounding again. I called out, "Is somebody here?" My voice echoed. No answer. My throat felt tight. I cleared it and tried to focus on the text again. As I turned back to the book, I noticed the pages began to flip on their own. My fingers weren't on the paper. I stared, feeling my chest tighten. The pages flipped slowly at first, then stopped on a chapter describing spiritual interactions. My palms felt clammy. I reached out and touched the page. It was still trembling, like a small breeze was blowing on it, but I didn't feel any air movement. I wrote down a note in my pad. Pages moving by themselves, 11:50 p.m. My watch indicated it was nearly midnight. I heard a clatter behind me. I spun around to see a pile of books slide off the shelf. They hit the floor with a dull thud. I stared at them, shining my flashlight along the tall shelves. No sign of anyone. The section was empty. My head felt light, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I couldn't walk away yet. I wanted to learn more, and I felt a strange urge to keep investigating. I picked up one of the fallen books. Its cover had a title in faint gold letters: Testimonies of the Unseen. I carried it to the table and opened it carefully. The pages felt dry and brittle. There were handwritten accounts of encounters with something that people felt but couldn't see. One entry described objects moving on their own. Another wrote about voices that seemed to echo through empty rooms. I recognized the same pattern I was experiencing. Soft sounds, unexpected movement, pages flipping. I heard another whisper, this time clearer. It was right at my ear level. I jumped so hard that my knee banged into the table. My flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the surface, throwing shaky light across the walls. My heart hammered. I gasped for air, trying to calm myself. I felt a warm sensation on my shoulder, like a hand pressing down, but no one was there. I slapped at my shoulder and grabbed the flashlight. My hands trembled so badly that I had trouble holding it steady. I backed away from the table. My mind was racing. I told myself maybe there was a draft, or maybe my imagination was going wild. Yet the physical touch felt real. The whisper had been close to my ear. I stepped toward the door, ready to leave, but I paused. Something made me glance back at those old books. I thought about my writing. This was an opportunity to document something unusual. Maybe the presence here wanted me to learn something. I inhaled, rubbed the sweat off my forehead, and walked back to the table. I forced my hands to steady enough to open the book again. I started reading an entry about a person who felt compelled to communicate with an unseen entity. The words described attempts to ask questions with knocks or letters. While I read, I tried speaking quietly. "Are you here? If so, can you show me?" I felt strange saying it, like I was performing a ritual. The room stayed silent except for my breathing. I waited. Nothing. I sighed. A minute later, the reading lamp flickered. I thought it had no bulb, but I saw a faint glow inside it. It lasted only a moment, then went dark again. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I aimed my flashlight at the lamp. There was no bulb in it. just an empty socket. My eyes were wide. I moved the flashlight away. Another clatter echoed from the far side of the room. I hurried over, shining the beam at the shelves. A small stool had tipped over. Next to it, a large ledger lay open on the floor. I crouched down and lifted it. It looked like a register of visitors, or maybe a record of library acquisitions. As I tried to read the old handwriting, the stool righted itself with a scraping sound on the floor. I froze. My lungs felt tight, and I couldn't catch a full breath. The stool now stood upright, as if someone had set it back. But I saw no one. I whispered, "Are you trying to communicate?" My voice sounded shaky. I didn't know if talking out loud made any sense, but I felt pressure in my chest that made me want to speak. I felt a hint of movement behind me again, like a presence shifting in the air. It didn't feel hostile. I wanted to bolt, but I also felt an odd curiosity pulling me to stay. I thought maybe this presence needed my help. My heart still pounded. My palms were sweaty. My flashlight beam jittered on the walls because my hand shook. I made my way back to the table, carrying the ledger. I set it down carefully. I flipped through the pages. Some entries listed old manuscripts with annotations. Others just had short notes about unusual topics. Case study, apparitions in the Northwest Wing, or Journal of Dr. Howard, unpublished experiments. The writing was crammed together in tight lines. I recognized a few references to the same phenomena mentioned in the other books. Whispers, moving objects, cold drafts. The entire record showed a pattern of attempts to document something unexplainable. I felt my pulse slow down a bit as I realized many people had encountered the same types of events. My fear mixed with a sense of awe. I felt a tap on my left shoulder. My body jerked. I spun around, shining my light. Nothing. The air was silent, but I noticed a faint swirl of dust near the ceiling. I closed my eyes for a moment, took a breath, and tried to calm my nerves. My mind was on high alert. I decided to see if I could help this invisible presence in some way. I remembered the notes about contact methods. People would sometimes write questions on a piece of paper, then watch for the pen to move. I pulled out a sheet from my notebook and wrote, "What do you want?" I set the pen down on top of the paper and stepped back. I stared at the paper, my flashlight pointing at it. The pen didn't move at first. I waited, feeling a chill in my spine. My muscles tensed so hard I started shaking. Then, to my surprise, the pen rolled slightly. It didn't write anything. It just rolled in a small circle. I said, "Okay, I see you." I waited, but nothing else happened. I wondered if I needed to ask differently. I wrote a second question. "Is there a specific message you want to share?" This time I stepped away and aimed my flashlight at the page again. The pen stood still. I waited a long time. Nothing. My shoulders slumped in disappointment. Yet I felt a presence near the edge of the table. I couldn't see it, but I sensed a faint movement of air. My mind kept replaying the items that had already moved on their own. Maybe it just couldn't write. I walked around the table to examine other books, looking for instructions. My backpack sat on the chair where I'd left it. I considered taking a voice recorder out of my bag, but then I remembered I didn't pack one. I only had my phone. I pulled it out and checked the battery level. 15%. No signal. I turned on the voice recording app and set the phone on the table. I hit record and asked, "Do you need help? Can you speak to me?" I felt silly, but I left it recording and moved a few feet away. The phone's screen glowed, and I saw the waves of my voice on the app's display. I waited in silence, scanning the dark corners of the room with my flashlight. I didn't hear a voice, but I felt another wave of cold air pass by me, brushing the side of my face. It made me shiver. The phone's wave display jumped for a moment, like it had picked up some sound. I bit my lip and watched. The wave pattern flickered and then steadied again. I stopped the recording and played it back. My voice sounded shaky. Then, in the silence, I heard something faint. It was a soft click or hiss. I couldn't make out words. My skin prickled. I glanced at the door. remembering how I had squeezed through the gap. Part of me wanted to escape and never come back, but the writer in me felt pulled to keep going. I wanted to document as much as I could. Something was clearly here. It wasn't harming me, but it was definitely making its presence known. I wiped sweat off my brow. I returned to the dusty shelves. I found a thin journal with a plain cover. I flipped it open. It had daily entries from a researcher who had stayed at the library after hours. The handwriting said things like, heard footsteps at 2 a.m., witnessed a book drop from the shelf with no one around, felt a cold breeze near the restricted area. I realized I wasn't the only one who had gone through this. The final pages of that journal ended abruptly without a conclusion. I set the journal aside. At that moment, the overhead lights flickered. They hadn't been on before, so the sudden burst of light startled me. They didn't fully illuminate the place, but they blinked a few times, enough to see dust swirling in the air. My flashlight was still on, its beam lost in the partial brightness. Then the lights went out again and darkness returned. My heart thumped. I felt another presence behind me. I turned around fast. This time I saw a faint outline. It wasn't a solid figure. It looked like a ripple in the air, almost transparent, but with a hint of a human shape. My stomach twisted and sweat trickled down my neck. I stepped backward, trying not to panic. The shape stayed in place, not moving toward me. I could hear my breathing, labored and harsh. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the shape faded. It was gone. My legs felt like they might buckle. I reached for the table to steady myself. My mind spun, but I remembered the pattern from the books. The presence probably couldn't stay visible for long. It seemed to want contact, but it couldn't maintain a form. I decided I had enough for one night. I slipped the thin journal into my backpack, hoping to study it later. I had to see if I could make sense of it back at home. I grabbed my notepad, phone, and flashlight. I approached the gap in the wall. My shoulders were tight and my nerves were on edge. I felt eyes on me, or at least I imagined it. As I squeezed through, a series of knocks sounded on the old wooden door. It made me jump. I nearly dropped my things. The knocks were slow, spaced out by a second or two. It felt like a goodbye, or maybe a plea to stay. I whispered, "I'll come back." Then I slid through the gap. In the hallway, I noticed my breathing was still uneven. I closed my eyes for a moment. The corridor felt safer than the archive room. The musty smell was less intense. I heard the distant hum of the library's main ventilation system. I tried to compose myself. My watch read 12:37 a.m. I walked back along the corridor, passing rows of shelves in the regular library. It felt strange to see these normal sections after what had happened inside that sealed area. I reached the main doors. They were locked, but I knew from earlier that the guard usually left a side exit open for cleaning staff. I found that exit and stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was dark, and the campus was empty. I felt relief wash over me as I inhaled the fresh air. My body still shook. I rubbed my arms to warm up. My thoughts stayed on the presence I had encountered. I couldn't figure out exactly what it wanted, but I suspected it needed a way to tell its story. Now as I sit here at my desk, I keep revisiting that moment when the shape appeared. I see the faint outline and remember the cold sensation on my face. My legs still feel weak when I picture the dusty shelf falling over without explanation. I wonder if I'll return tomorrow night. Part of me is anxious to know more, but another part is scared. I can't deny that something is going on in that locked section of the library. Something that doesn't belong to normal life. I keep hearing that whisper in my ear. I keep feeling that pressure on my shoulder. It's like an invisible invitation, a request for help, or maybe just a desire to be acknowledged. I don't know if I can help. I do know I have pages of notes in a journal that might guide me further. For now, I'm going to process everything I saw, heard, and felt. But I sense I'm not done with that old library. Whatever is locked up in there still wants to communicate. And part of me is ready to listen. I arrived at the small inn late in the afternoon. I had a heavy duffel bag with my running shoes, some outdoor clothes, and basic gear. The place looked normal at first glance. It had a faded sign above the entrance, a few empty benches along the porch, and a single streetlight that flickered when I walked in. The innkeeper didn't say much. He handed me a worn key and pointed me down a hallway. He seemed distracted, like he wanted me to leave him alone. I didn't mind. I came here to focus on running trails and maybe some light climbing in the nearby forest. The forest was old. People called it a centuries-old woodland, but I didn't care about its history at the time. I just wanted fresh air and quiet paths. I checked into my room and dropped my bag on the floor. The room had a single bed, a wooden table, and a small lamp. The walls were a dull green with a few scratches. There was a window that overlooked the back of the inn, facing the tree line. It smelled a bit stuffy, like nobody had opened a window there in a while. The sheet on the bed looked clean enough, so I didn't complain. I planned to stay for a few nights. After all, I wanted to run in nature and escape my noisy routine back home. This area seemed perfect for that. Before dinner, I decided to step outside and get a feel for the surroundings. The sun was still hanging in the sky, but it was starting to lower behind the treetops. A path led from the back of the inn into the forest. The locals had mentioned a few trails that cut through the woods, so I followed the path, hoping I'd find a spot to do some jogging in the morning. As soon as I passed the first line of tall pine trees, I noticed something strange. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of small animals, nothing. The air wasn't even that cold, but I felt a slight shiver creep through my arms. My eyes moved around, trying to spot any movement among the leaves or branches. Nothing caught my eye. It was just quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I walked deeper, crunching small twigs under my feet. I kept expecting to hear a startled bird or maybe see a squirrel dart across my path. But there was only the sound of my own footsteps. I didn't want to freak myself out, so I tried to dismiss the silence as some quirk of this place. Maybe the animals were further in, or maybe it was just an off day. I turned around after a few minutes, planning to come back in the morning with better gear. As I headed back to the inn, I caught a glimpse of an odd shape deeper in the woods. It looked like a small structure, maybe an old cabin, but it was too dark to tell. I made a mental note to check it out later. That evening, I ate a simple meal in the inn's dining room. The innkeeper walked past me a few times, but he didn't start any conversation. I felt a slight tension in the air. The few other guests at nearby tables seemed to speak in hushed voices. I assumed they were just private people. I was used to traveling alone, so I wasn't bothered by the silence. After dinner, I returned to my room and tried to sleep. The bed was firm, and the sheets were a bit rough, but it was fine. I kept thinking about the quiet forest, though. The complete lack of wildlife made me uneasy. Still, I dozed off eventually. The next morning, I woke up early. It was around 6 o'clock when I stepped outside. The air was crisp and cool, and the sky was clear. I started my run on the main trail behind the inn. The trail was wide enough for me to jog comfortably. For about 5 minutes, everything felt normal. I heard my own breathing and the rhythmic impact of my shoes on the dirt. But once I crossed a cluster of old oak trees, I entered that zone of perfect stillness again. My footsteps sounded louder. I slowed down, feeling that something wasn't right. I looked around and saw dense undergrowth, thick bushes, and towering trunks. But I didn't see or hear any wildlife. I checked my watch, took a sip of water from my bottle, and kept going. I didn't feel threatened exactly, but I felt uneasy. Further down the path, I saw that old structure I had noticed the previous day. It was a wooden building that looked like some kind of shack or cabin. The roof sagged in the middle, and a few planks were missing from the walls. I slowed my jog to a walk and approached it carefully. The door was gone, so I could see inside. There was a rotting chair in one corner and a few wooden beams crossing the ceiling. My eyes were drawn to some strange carvings on those beams. They were small symbols cut into the wood. They almost looked like they'd been etched there a long time ago, maybe to seal something in or keep something out. I touched one of the carvings and felt a rough groove under my fingertips. There was a strange pattern to them, but I couldn't read them. They just looked unfamiliar and unsettling. I felt a small chill crawling up my spine, so I backed out of the shack. The air outside felt heavy. Even though it was still morning, I sensed a kind of pressure on my chest. I took a deep breath and returned to the trail. I ran back to the inn and tried to push those images out of my head. I told myself I was here for exercise, not for ghost stories. Still, I felt a nagging curiosity. I wanted to understand why the forest was so silent, and I wanted to figure out what was going on with that shack. Later that day, I tried a different trail that veered off to the east. The sign at the trailhead was weathered, with faded paint. The trail itself was lined with gnarled trees, their branches twisted in odd angles. Some of them bent toward the path like they were trying to reach me. The more I walked, the more I felt an odd tension in my body. My arms felt tight and I kept clenching my fists. There was still no sound of birds or insects. My heartbeat sounded loud in my own ears. Every once in a while I had to stop and catch my breath because the silence felt crushing. I saw faint footprints on the dirt, maybe from older hikers or from animals, but I didn't see any fresh tracks. I carried on until I reached a small clearing. That clearing had a few mossy boulders and one big pine tree in the center. Its trunk had deep scars, like someone had carved lines into it. While I examined those marks, I thought I saw a figure in my peripheral vision. I snapped my head to the side, but there was nothing there. I inhaled sharply, feeling my pulse accelerate. I decided to head back. Something about that place gave me goosebumps. When I reached the inn again, I found the innkeeper outside, smoking a cigarette. I stood near him and tried to start a conversation. I asked him about the forest, about the abandoned shack, and about the strange markings. He just looked at me with a tense expression. His eyes flicked toward the forest, then back to me. He said something like, "I don't go there," and threw his cigarette butt on the ground. Then he walked away. That made my stomach knot up. The guy had no interest in chatting about it. I decided to drop the subject and just get some dinner. That night I had trouble sleeping. My window faced the forest, and the tree branches outside looked twisted under the moonlight. A few times I thought I heard footsteps in the distance, but I couldn't be sure. It might have been the wind in the branches. My heart rate refused to slow down. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was just scaring myself for no reason. The silence outside was unnerving. I tossed and turned and eventually fell asleep sometime after midnight. The next morning, I woke up feeling anxious. My chest felt tight, and my neck muscles were stiff. Despite that, I felt drawn to the forest again. I grabbed my water bottle and decided to explore. I reasoned that maybe if I went earlier, I'd catch some morning activity. But as soon as I entered that first row of tall trees, I felt like I'd stepped into a vacuum. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my own breathing. I passed the shack again. The doorless frame looked the same, but the symbols on the beams seemed more pronounced. I glanced inside and saw something that looked like a burnt-out lantern on the ground. I didn't remember seeing that before. I stepped into the shack, crouched down, and picked up the lantern. Its metal handle was cold. The glass was cracked. I set it back down and stood up, eyeing those symbols again. I reached up and traced one with my fingertip. My skin prickled, and my hair stood up on the back of my neck. My hand felt numb, like I'd touched something charged with static. That scared me, so I pulled my hand away and left. As I walked back onto the trail, I noticed the vegetation around the shack looked more twisted than before. Some of the vines curled around the trees in a tight grip, almost strangling the branches. The ground was soft in places, leaving deep prints of my boots. I felt like the forest was watching me. I checked over my shoulder every few steps. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow pass between two large trees. It looked human in shape, but it slid away too fast for me to confirm. My hands shook a little, and I gripped my water bottle to steady them. I kept walking, trying to ignore the dread building inside me. The path curved to the left, and the tree trunks seemed closer together. The air felt thick, and I could feel sweat collecting on my forehead. Then I saw another shadow out of the corner of my eye. This time, it stood still, about 20 feet away, just behind a cluster of thin tree trunks. It looked like a person, but I couldn't see any features. It was just a dark outline. My mouth went dry. I stared at it, not sure if I should run or speak. It didn't move. I took a cautious step toward it. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then it faded back like it melted into the darkness. The silence around me felt crushing. I didn't even hear leaves rustle. I turned and hurried out of the forest. I didn't bother running because I was afraid I'd trip on roots or rocks, but I walked as fast as I could. When I got back to the inn, I was sweating and panting. The innkeeper noticed my state but didn't ask any questions. I went straight to my room, splashed water on my face, and sat on the edge of the bed trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and getting out of that place. But I also felt a strange pull that kept me from leaving. I wanted to understand what I was seeing. I wanted to know why the forest was so silent and why I kept seeing those figures. That evening, I forced myself to eat something in the dining area, but my stomach was tight. I couldn't enjoy the food. A couple of other guests were there, quietly eating. The air in the room felt heavy. Nobody seemed to smile or talk. After dinner, I went back to my room. The window overlooked the same dark outline of trees. I pulled the curtains closed and tried to read a magazine, but my hands kept trembling. I couldn't concentrate on the words. I turned off the lamp and lay in bed, staring at the dark. My ears were straining for any sound, but I only heard my own breathing. Early the next day, I decided to visit the shack one last time. I wanted to see if the symbols had changed. I walked slowly along the main trail, glancing around. The trees looked even more twisted, like their limbs had grown in the night. When I reached the shack, I felt my chest tighten. The structure seemed darker somehow. I stepped inside and looked up. The symbols on the beams appeared deeper, like someone had cut into them again. My breath caught in my throat. Then I saw something in the corner. A silhouette. It resembled a man, but it had no distinct features. It stood there, motionless. My entire body tensed. I felt sweat trickle down my back. I stared at it and it seemed to look back. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt its attention. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry. My chest burned as I forced myself to breathe. The figure didn't move, and I realized I was still clenching my fists. My nails dug into my palms. Then I heard a faint whisper, like an exhalation of air, but I couldn't understand any words. I didn't know if it was the figure or just my own breath echoing in my head. I backed away, stepping outside. The forest felt closer than ever, like the trees had moved in around the shack. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a few shadows among the trunks. They stood there, not coming closer. My face felt hot, and my knees felt unsteady. I turned my back on them and walked as fast as I could. I kept going until I broke through the edge of the forest and saw the back of the inn. My lungs burned and my legs felt weak. Once I reached my room, I grabbed my bag and started throwing my things into it. I couldn't stand another minute there. My heart was still racing, and my mind felt foggy. I just wanted to get out of that place. I'm not sure if the forest had some hidden presence or if my imagination made everything worse. All I know is that the silence never stopped, and those shadows felt real. I paid for my stay and left as soon as I could. As I drove away, I avoided looking in the rearview mirror, afraid I'd see something following me. I felt relief once the inn and the forest were out of sight. But even now, I can still remember the way that silence wrapped around me, and how those shadows watched me from between the gnarled trees. I can't forget those symbols in the old wooden beams either. They're stuck in my mind, like a warning that I can't shake. I haven't returned to that place. I don't plan to. I still run in nature sometimes, but I pick other locations. I stick to places where I can hear birds and see squirrels and breathe without feeling like something is watching me. That old forest and the shack within it are now just memories, but they cling to me and I can't seem to push them away. The silence I found there was different from normal quiet. It was a silence that pressed against my chest and made my skin crawl. I'm not sure what lurks in those trees, and I don't think I want to find out.